Citadel by Algis Budrys. He was looking for a privacy his strange personality needed, and never quite seemed to achieve it. All his efforts were somehow great triumphs of the race, and great failures for him. Section 1. The aging man was sweating profusely, and he darted sidelong glances at the windowless walls of the outer office. By turns he sat stiffly in a corner chair, or paced uneasily, his head swiveling constantly. His hand was clammy when Meade shook it. "Hello, Mr. Meade," he said in a husky, hesitant voice, his eyes never quite still, never long on Meade's face, but darting hither and yon, his glance rebounding at every turn from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, the closed outer door. Christopher Meade, Assistant Undersecretary for External Affairs, returned the handshake smiling. "Please come into my office," he said quickly. "It's much more spacious." "Thank you," the aging man said gratefully, and hurried into the next room. Meade rapidly opened the windows, and some of the man's nervousness left him. He sank down into the visitor's chair in front of Meade's desk, his eyes drinking in the distances beyond the windows. "Thank you," he repeated. Meade sat down behind the desk, leaned back, and waited for the man's breathing to slow. Finally he said, "It's good to see you again, Mr. Holliday. What can I do for you?" Martin Holliday tore his glance away from the window long enough to raise his eyes to Meade's face, and then drop them to the hands he had folded too deliberately in his lap. "I'd—" His voice husked into unintelligibility, and he had to begin again. "I'd like to take an option on a new planet," he said finally. Meade nodded. "I don't see why not." He gestured expressively at the star chart papered over one wall of his office. "We've certainly got plenty of them. But what happened with your first one?" Mr. Holliday, I certainly won't be offended if you'd prefer to look out the window," Meade said quickly. "Thank you." After a moment he began again. "It didn't work out," he said, his glance flickering back to Meade for an instant before he had to look out the window again. "I don't know where my figuring went wrong. It didn't go wrong. It was just things. I thought I could sell enough subdivisions to cover the payments and still keep most of it for myself, but it didn't work out." He looked quickly at Meade with a flash of groundless guilt in his eyes. "First I had to sell more than I'd intended, because I had to lower the original price. Somebody'd option another planet in the same system, and I hadn't counted on the competition. Then, even after I'd covered the option and posted surety on the payments, there were all kinds of expenses. Then I couldn't lease the mineral rights." He looked at Meade again, as though he had to justify himself. "I don't know how that deal fell through. The company just withdrew all of a sudden." "Do you think there might have been anything peculiar about that?" Meade asked. "I mean, could the company have made a deal with the colonists for a lower price after you'd been forced out?" Holliday shook his head quickly. "Oh no, nothing like that. The colonists and I got along fine. It wasn't as though I hadn't put the best land up for sale, or tried to make myself rich. Why, after I'd had to sell some of the remaining land, and I knew it wasn't worth staying any more, some of them offered to lend me enough money to keep 50,000 square miles for myself." He smiled warmly, his eyes blank while he focused on memory. "But that wasn't it, of course," he went on. "I had my original investment back, but I couldn't tell them why I couldn't stay. It was people. Even if I never saw them, it was the thought of people with aircraft and rockets and roads." "I understand, Mr. Holliday," Meade said in an effort to spare him embarrassment. Holliday looked at him helplessly. "I couldn't tell them that, could I, Mr. Meade? They were good people, friendly people who wanted to help me. I couldn't tell them it was people, could I?" He wet his dry lips and locked his eyes on the view outside the window. "All I want, Mr. Meade, is half a planet to myself," he said softly. He shook his head. "Well, it'll work out this time. This time I won't have to sell so much, and I'll have a place to spend what time I've got left in peace without this. He gestured helplessly in an effort to convey his tortured consciousness of his own fear. Meade nodded quickly as he saw his features knot convulsively. "Of course, Mr. Holliday. We'll get you an option on a new planet as quickly as we can." "Thank you," Holliday said again. Can we handle it today? I've had my credit transferred to a local bank." "Certainly, Mr. Holliday. We won't keep you on Earth a moment longer than absolutely necessary." He took a standard form out of a desk drawer and passed it to Holliday for his signature. "I'll be smarter this time," the aging man said, trying to convince himself as he uncapped his pen. "This time it'll work out." "I'm sure it will, Mr. Holliday," Meade said. Section 2. Marlowe was obese. He sat behind his desk like a tuskless sea lion crouched behind a rock, and his cheeks merged into jowls and obliterated his neck. His desk was built specially so that he could get his thighs under it. His office chair was heavier and wider by far than any standard size, its casters rolling on a special composition base that had been laid down over the carpeting, for Marlowe's weight would have cut any ordinary rug to shreds. His jacket stretched like pliofilm to enclose the bulk of his stooped shoulders, and his eyes surveyed his world behind the battlemented heaviness of the puffing flesh that filled their sockets. A bulb flickered on his interphone set, and Marlowe shot a glance at the switch beneath it. "Secretary quite contrary," he muttered inaudibly. He flicked the switch. "Yes, Mary?" His voice rumbled out of the flabby cavern of his chest. "Mr. Meade just filed a report on Martin Holliday, Mr. Secretary. Would you like to see it?" "Just give me a summary, Mary." Under his breath he whispered, "Summary that mummery, Mary," and a thin smile fell about his lips while he listened. "Gave him Karlshaven 4, eh?" he observed when his secretary finished. "Okay, thanks, Mary." He switched off and sat thinking. Somewhere in the bowels of the body administrative, he knew notations were being made and cross-filed. The addition of Karlshaven 4 to the list of planets under colonization would be made, and Holliday's asking prices for land would be posted with emigration, together with a prospectus abstracted from the General Galactic Survey. He switched the interphone on again. Mary, supply me with a copy of the Gen Serve on the entire Karlshaven system. Tell Mr. Meade I'll expect him in my office sometime this afternoon. You schedule it, and we'll go into it further." "Yes, Mr. Secretary. Will 15:15 be all right?" 15:15's fine, Mary," Marlowe said gently. "Yes, sir," his secretary replied, abashed. "I keep forgetting about proper nomenclature." "So do I, Mary. So do I," Marlowe sighed. "Anything come up that wasn't scheduled for today?" It was a routine question, born of futile hope. There was always something to spoil the carefully planned daily schedules. "Yes and no, sir." Marlowe cocked an eyebrow at the interphone. "Well, that's a slight change, anyway. What is it?" "There's a political science observer from Dovenil, that's more 2 on our map, sir, who's requested permission to talk to you. He's here on the usual exchange program, and he's within his privileges in asking, of course. I assume it's the ordinary thing. What's our foreign policy? How do you apply it? Can you give specific instances? And the like." Precisely, Marlowe thought. For ordinary questions there were standard answers, and Mary had been his secretary for so long that she could supply them as well as he could. Dovenil. More 2, eh? Obviously there was something special about the situation, and Mary was leaving the decision to him. He scanned through his memorized star catalogs, trying to find the correlation. "Mr. Secretary?" Marlowe grunted. "Still here, just thinking. Isn't Dovenil that nation we just sent Harrison to?" "Yes, sir, on the same exchange program." Marlowe chuckled. "Well, if we've got Harrison down there, it's only fair to let their fellow learn something in exchange, isn't it? What's his name?" "Dalish ud Klavan, sir." Marlowe muttered to himself. "Dalish ud Klavan. Irish corned beef and cabbage." His mind filed it away together with a primary color picture of Jiggs and Maggie. "All right, Mary, I'll talk to him if you can find room in the schedule somewhere. Tell you what, let him in at 15:30. Meade and I can furnish a working example for him. Does that check all right with your book?" "Yes, sir. There'll be time if we carry over on the Ceroli incidents." "Ceroli's waited 6 years, 4 months, and 23 days. They'll wait another day. Let's do that then, Mary." "Yes, sir." Marlowe switched off and picked up a report which he began to read by the page block system, his eyes almost unblinking between pages. "Harrison, eh?" he muttered once, stopping to look quizzically at his desktop. He chuckled. Section 3. At 15:15 the light on his interphone blinked twice, and Marlowe hastily initialed a directive with his right hand while touching the switch with his left. "Yes, Mary?" "Mr. Meade, sir." Okay. He switched off, pushed the directive into his outbox, and pulled the GenServe and the folder on Martin Holliday out of the hold tray. "Come in, Chris," he said as Meade knocked on the door. "How are you today, Mr. Marlowe?" Meade asked as he sat down. 4 ounces heavier," Marlowe answered dryly. "I presume you're not. Cigarette, Chris?" Apparently the use of the first name finally caught Meade's notice. He looked thoughtful for a moment, then took a cigarette and lit it. "Thanks, Dave." "Well, I'm glad that's settled," Marlowe chuckled, his eyes almost disappearing in crinkles of flesh. "How's Mary?" Meade grinned crookedly. "Miss Folsom is in fine fettle today, thank you." Marlowe rumbled a laugh. Meade had once made the mistake of addressing the woman as Mary, under the natural assumption that if Marlowe could do it, everyone could. "Mary, I fear," Marlowe observed, "lives in more stately times than these. She'll tolerate informality from me because I'm in direct authority over her, and direct authority, of course, is law. But you, Meade, you are a young whippersnapper." "But that's totally unrealistic," Meade protested. "I don't respect her less by using her first name. It's just friendliness, that's all." "Look," Marlowe said, "it makes sense, but it ain't logical. Not on her terms. Mary Folsom was raised by a big, tough, tight-lipped authoritarian of a father who believed in bringing kids up by the book. By the time she got tumbled out into the world, all big men were unquestionably authority, and all young men were callow whippersnappers. Sure, she's unhappy about it inside, but it makes her a perfect secretary for me, and she does her job well. We play by her rules on the little things and by the world's rules on the big ones. Capiche?" "Sure, Dave, but—" Marlowe picked up the folder on Holliday and gave Meade one weighty but understanding look before he opened it. "Your trouble, Chris, is that your viewpoint is fundamentally sane," he said. "Now, about Holliday, Martin. Options 062268729, 06310810004. I didn't get time to read the GenServe on the Karlshaven planet, so I'll ask you to brief me." "Yes, sir." "What's 4 like?" "Good arable land, a little mountainous in spots, but that's good. Loaded with minerals, industrial stuff like silver. Some tin, but not enough to depress the monetary standard. Lots of copper, coal beds, petroleum basins, the works. Self-supporting practically from the start. A real asset to the Union in 56 years. Marlowe nodded. "Good. Nice picking, Chris. Now, got a decoy?" "Yes, sir. Karlshaven II's a false E. I've got a dummy option on it in the works, and we'll be able to undercut Holliday's prices for his land by about 20%. False E, huh? How long do you figure until the colony can't stick on it any longer?" "A fair-sized one, with lots of financial backing, might even make it permanently. But we won't be able to dig up that many loafers, and naturally we can't give them that big a subsidy. Eventually we'll have to ferry them all out, in about 8 years, say, but that'll give us time enough to break Holliday." Marlowe nodded again. "Sounds good." "Something else," Meade said. "II's mineral poor. It's near to being solid metal. That's what makes it impossible to really live on, but I figure we can switch the mineral companies right onto it and off of 4. Marlowe grinned approvingly. "You've been saving this one for Holliday." "Yes, sir," Meade said, nodding slowly. He looked hesitantly at Marlowe. "What's up, boy?" "Well, sir," Meade began, then stopped. "Nothing important, really." Marlowe gave him a surprising look full of sadness and brooding understanding. "You're thinking he's an old frightened man, and why don't we leave him alone?" "Why, yes, sir." "Dave." "Yes, Dave, you're quite right. Why don't we?" "We can't, sir, I know that, but it doesn't seem fair." "Exactly, Chris. It ain't right, but it's correct." The light on Marlowe's interphone blinked once. Marlowe looked at it in momentary surprise. Then his features cleared, and he muttered, "Cabbage." He reached out toward the switch. "We've got a visitor, Chris. Follow my lead." He reviewed his information on Dovnalid titular systems while he touched the switch. "Ask Ud Klavan to come in, Mary." Section 4. Dalish Ud Klavan was almost a twin for the pictured typical Dovnalid in Marlowe's library. Since the pictures were usually idealized, it followed that Klavan was an above-average specimen of his people. He stood a full 8 feet from fetters to crest, and had not yet begun to thicken his shoes in compensation for the stoop that marked advancing middle age for his race. Marlowe looked at him, smiled inwardly. No Dovenilid could be so obviously superior and still only a lowly student. Well, considering Harrison's qualifications, it might still not be tit for tat. Meade began to get to his feet, and Marlowe hastily planted a foot atop his nearest shoe. The assistant winced and twitched his lips, but at least he stayed down. "Dalish ud Klavan," the Dovenilid pronounced in good English. "Dave Marlowe, Secretary for External Affairs, Solar Union," Marlowe replied. Ud Klavan looked expectantly at Meade. "Christopher Meade, Assistant Undersecretary for External Affairs," the assistant said, orienting himself. "If you would do us the honor of permitting us to stand," Marlowe asked politely. "On the contrary, Marlowe, if you would do me the honor of permitting me to sit, I should consider it a privilege." "Please do so. Mr. Meade, if you would bring our visitor a chair." They lost themselves in formalities for a few minutes, Marlowe being urbanely correct, Meade following after as best he could through the maze of Dovenilid mores. Finally they were able to get down to the business at hand. Ud Klavan sitting with considerable comfort in the carefully designed chair which could be snapped into almost any shape, Marlowe bulking behind his desk, Meade sitting somewhat nervously beside him. "Now, as I understand it, Ud Klavan," Marlowe began, "you'd like to learn something of our policies and methods." "That is correct, Marlowe and Meade." The Dovenilid extracted a block of opaque material from the flat wallet at his side and steadied it on his knee. "I have your permission to take notes?" "Please do. Now, as it happens, Mr. Meade and I are currently considering a case which perfectly illustrates our policies." Ud Klavan immediately traced a series of ideographs on the note block, and Marlowe wondered if he was actually going to take their conversation down verbatim. He shrugged mentally. He'd have to ask him at some later date whether he'd missed anything. Undoubtedly there'd be a spare recording of the tape he himself was making. "To begin, as you know, our government is founded upon principles of extreme personal freedom. There are no arbitrary laws governing expression, worship, the possession of personal weapons, or the rights of personal property. The state is construed to be a mechanism of public service, operated by the body politic, and the actual regulation and regimentation of society is accomplished by natural socio-economic laws, which, of course, are both universal and unavoidable. We pride ourselves on the high status of the individual in comparison to the barely tolerable existence of the state. We do naturally have ordinances and injunctions governing crimes, but even these are usually superseded by civil actions at the personal level." Marlowe leaned forward a trifle. "Forgetting exact principles for a moment, Ud Klavan, you realize that the actuality will sometimes stray from the ideal. Our citizens, for example, do not habitually carry weapons, except under extraordinary conditions. But that is a civil taboo rather than a fixed amendation of our Constitution. I have no doubt that some future generation, mores having shifted, will, for example, revive the Code Duello." Ud Klavan nodded. "Quite understood. Thank you, Marlowe." "Good. Now to proceed. Under conditions such as those, the state and its agencies cannot lay down a fixed policy of any sort and expect it to be in the least bit permanent. The people will not tolerate such regulation, and with each new shift in social mores, and the institution of any policy is itself sufficient to produce such a shift within a short time, successive policies are repudiated by the body politic and new ones must be instituted." Marlowe leaned back and spread his hands. "Therefore," he said, with a rueful smile, "it can fairly be said that we have no foreign policy, effectively speaking. We pursue the expedient, Ud Klavan, and hope for the best. The case which Mr. Meade and I are currently considering is typical. The Union, as you know, maintains a General Survey Corps, whose task it is to map the galaxy, surveying such planets as harbor alien races or seem suitable for human colonization. Such a survey team, for example, first established contact between your people and ours. Exchange observation rights are worked out, and representatives of both races are given the opportunity to acquaint themselves with the society of the other. In the case of unoccupied habitable planets, however, the state's function ceases with the filing of a complete and definite survey at the Under Ministry for Emigration. The state, as a state, sponsors no colonies and makes no establishments except for the few staging bases which are maintained for the use of the Survey Corps. We have not yet found any need for the institution of an offensive service, analogous to a planetary army, nor do we expect to. War in space is possible only under extraordinary conditions, and we foresee no such contingency. All our colonization is carried out by private citizens who apply to Mr. Meade here for options on suitable unoccupied planets. Mr. Meade's function is to act as a consultant in these cases. He maintains a roster of surveyed human habitable planets and either simply assigns the requested planet or recommends one to fit specified conditions. The cost of the option is sufficient to cover the administrative effort involved, together with sufficient profit to the government to finance further surveys. The individual holding the option is then referred to Emigration, which provides copies of a prospectus taken from the General Survey Report and advertises the option holder's asking prices on subdivisions. Again, there is a reasonable fee of a nature similar to ours, devoted to the same purposes. The state then ceases to have any voice in the projected colonization whatsoever. It is a totally private enterprise, a simple real estate operation, if you will, with the state acting only as an advertising agency and occasionally as the lessor of suitable transportation from Earth to the new planet. The colonists, of course, are under our protection, maintaining full citizenship unless they request independence, which is freely granted. If you would like to see it for purposes of clarification, you are welcome to examine our file on Martin Holliday, a citizen who is fairly typical of these real estate operators and who has just filed an option on his second planet. Smiling, Marlowe extended the folder. "Thank you, I should like to," Oudklavin said, and took the file from Marlowe. He leafed through it rapidly, pausing after asking Marlowe's leave to make notes on some of the information, and then handed it back. "Most interesting," Oudklavin observed. "However, if you'll enlighten me, this man, Martin Holliday, wouldn't there seem to be very little incentive for him, considering his age, even if there is the expectation of a high monetary return, particularly since his first attempt, while not a failure, was not an outstanding financial success?" Marlowe shrugged helplessly. "I tend to agree with you thoroughly, Oudklavin, but," he smiled, "you'll agree, I'm sure, that one Earthman's boredom is another's incentive. We are not a rigorously logical race, Oudklavin." "Quite," the Dovenilid replied. Section 5. Marlowe stared at his irrevocable clock. His interphone light flickered, and he touched the switch absently. "Yes, Mary?" "Will there be anything else, Mr. Secretary?" "No, thank you, Mary. Good night." "Good night, sir." There was no appeal. The day was over, and he had to go home. He stared helplessly at his empty office, his mind automatically counting the pairs of departing footsteps that sounded momentarily as clerks and stenographers crossed the walk below his partly open window. Finally he rolled his chair back and pushed himself to his feet. Disconsolate, he moved irresolutely to the window and watched the people leave. Washington. Aging, crowded Washington, mazed by narrow streets carrying the burden of the severe, unimaginative past on its grimy architecture, respired heavily under the sinking sun. The capital ought to be moved, he thought, as he'd thought every night at this time, nearer the heart of the empire, out of this steamy bog, out of this warren. His heavy lips moved into an ironical comment on his own thoughts. No one was ever going to move the empire's traditional seat. There was too much nostalgia concentrated here, along with the humidity. Some day, when the Union was contiguous with the entire galaxy, men would still call Washington, on old, out-of-the-way Earth, their capital. Man was not a rigorously logical race, as a race. The thought of going home broke out afresh, insidiously avoiding the barriers of bemusement which he had tried to erect, and he turned abruptly away from the window, moving decisively so as to be able to move at all. He yanked open a desk drawer and stuffed his jacket pockets with candy bars, ripping the film from one and chewing on its end while he put papers in his briefcase. Finally he could not delay any longer. Everyone else was out of the building, and the robots were taking over. Metal treads spun along the corridors bearing brooms, and the robot switchboards guarded the communications of the ministry. Soon the char robots would be bustling into this very office. He sighed and walked slowly out, down the empty halls where no human eye could see him waddling. He stepped into his car, and as he opened the door, the automatic recording said, "Home, please," in his own voice. The car waited until he was settled and then accelerated gently, pointing for his apartment. The recording had been an unavoidable but vicious measure of his own. He'd had to resort to it, for the temptation to drive to a terminal, to an airport or rocket field or railroad station, anywhere, had become excruciating. The car stopped for a pedestrian light, and a sports model bounced jauntily to a stop beside it. The driver cocked an eyebrow at Marlowe and chuckled. "Say, Fatso, which one of you's the Buick?" Then the light changed, the car spurted away, and left Marlowe cringing. He would not get an official car and protect himself with its license number. He would not be a coward. He would not. His fingers shaking, he tore the film from another candy bar. Marlowe huddled in his chair, the notebook clamped on one broad thigh by his heavy hand, his lips mumbling nervously while his pencil point checked off meter. "Dwell in aching discontent," he muttered. "No, not that." He stared down at the floor, his eyes distant. "Bitter discontent," he whispered. He grunted softly, with the breath that had to force its way past the constricting weight of his hunched chest. "Bitter dwell." He crossed out the third line, substituted the new one, and began to read the first two verses to himself. "We are born of humankind. This is our destiny. To bitter dwell in discontent, wherever we may be. To strangle with the burden of that which heals us on. To stake our fresh beginnings when frailer breeds have done." He smiled briefly, content. It still wasn't perfect, but it was getting closer. He continued, "To pile upon the ashes of races in decease such citadels of our kind's own as fortify no—" "What are you doing, David?" his wife asked over his shoulder. Flinching, he pulled the notebook closer into his lap, bending forward in an instinctive effort to protect it. The warm, loving, sawing voice went on. "Are you writing another poem, David? Why, I thought you'd given that up." It's nothing really, Lenora. Nothing much. Just a thing I've had running around my head. Wanted to get rid of it." His wife leaned over and kissed his cheek clumsily. "Why, you old big dear, I'll bet it's for me, isn't it, David? Isn't it for me?" He shook his head in almost desperate regret. I'm afraid not, Snorer. It's about something else, Lenora." "Oh." She came around the chair, and he furtively wiped his cheek with a hasty hand. She sat down facing him, smiling with entreaty. "Would you read it to me anyway, David? Please, dear?" "Well, it's not finished yet. Not right." "You don't have to, David. It's not important. Not really." She sighed deeply. He picked up the notebook, his breath cold in his constricted throat. "All right," he said, the words coming out huskily. "I'll read it, but it's not finished yet." "If you don't want to—" He began to read hurriedly, his eyes locked on the notebook, his voice a suppressed, hoarse, spasmodic whisper. "Such citadels of our own kind's own as fortify no peace. No wall can offer shelter, no roof can shield from pain. We cannot rest, we are the damned, we must go forth again. Unnumbered we must—" "David, are you sure about those last lines?" She smiled apologetically. "I know I'm old-fashioned, but couldn't you change that? It seems so harsh. And I think you may have unconsciously borrowed it from someone else. I can't help thinking I've heard it before somewhere. Don't you think so?" "I don't know, dear. You may be right about that word, but it doesn't really matter, does it? I mean, I'm not going to try to get it published or anything." "I know, dear, but still—" He was looking at her desperately. "I'm sorry, dear," she said contritely. "Please go on. Don't pay any attention to my stupid comments." "They're not stupid." "Please, dear, go on." His fingers clamped on the edge of the notebook. "Unnumbered we must wander, break and bleed and die. Implacable as ocean, our tide must drown the sky. What is our expiation? For what primeval crime? That we must go on marching until the crash of time. What hand has shaped so cruelly? What whim has cast such fate? Where is in our creation the botch that makes us great?" "Oh, that's good, darling. That's very good. I'm proud of you, David." I think it stinks, he said evenly, but anyway, there are 2 more verses. David. Grimly, he spat out the last 8 lines. Why are we ever gimleted by empire's irony? Is discontent the cancered pride of Earthman's galaxy? Lenora, recoiling from his cold fury, was a shaking pair of shoulders and a mass of lank hair supported by her hands on her face while she sobbed. Are souls so much perverted? Can we not relent? Or are the stars the madman's cost for his inborn discontent? Good night, Lenora. Section 6. The light flickered on Marlowe's interphone. Good morning, Mr. Secretary. Good morning, Mary. What's up? Harrison's being deported from Dovenil, sir. There's a civil crime charged against him. Quite a serious one. Marlowe's eyebrows went up. How much have we got on it? Not much, sir. Harrison's report hasn't come in yet, but the story's on the news broadcasts now, sir. We haven't been asked to comment yet, but emigration has been called by several news outlets, and the Ministry for Education just called here and inquired whether it would be all right to publish a general statement of their exchange students' careful instructions against violating local customs. Marlowe's glance brooded down on the mass of papers piled in the tray of his inbox. Give me a tape of a typical broadcast, he said at last. Hold everything else. Present explanations to all news outlets. None now. Statement forthcoming after preliminary investigation later in the day. The Ministry regrets this incident deeply and will try to settle matters as soon and as amicably as possible, etc., etc. Okay? Yes, sir. He swung his chair around to face the screen let into a side wall, and colors began to flicker and run in the field almost immediately. They steadied and sharpened, and the broadcast tape began to roll. Dateline. Dovenil, Sector 3, Day 183, 2417 GST. Your topical news reporter on this small planet at the Union's rim was unable today to locate for comment any of the high officials of this alien civilization directly concerned with the order for the deportation of exchange student observer Hubert Harrison, charged with theft and violent assault on the person of a Dovenilid citizen. Union citizen Harrison was unavailable for comment at this time, but topical news will present his views and such other clues when more ensues. Marlowe grunted. Journalese was getting out of hand again. That last rhyming sentence was sure to stick in the audience's brains. It might be only another advertising gimmick, but if they started doing it with the body of the news itself, it might be well to feed topical enough false leads to destroy what little reputation for comprehensibility they had left. He touched his interphone switch. Mary, what was the hooper on that broadcast? Under 1%, sir. Which meant that so far the body politic hadn't reacted. Thank you. Is there anything else coming in? Not at the moment, sir. What's Dalishud Klavan doing? His residence is the Solar Hostel, sir. The management reports that he is still in his room and has not reserved space on any form of long-distance transportation. He has not contacted us either, and there is a strong probability that he may still be unaware of what's happened. How many calls did he make yesterday, either before or after he was here, and to whom? I can get you a list in 10 minutes, sir. Do that, Mary. He switched off, sat slapping the edge of his desk with his hand, and switched on again. Mary, I want the gen serves on the Dovenil area to a depth of 10 cubic lights. Yes, sir. And get me Mr. Meade on the phone, please. Yes, sir. Marlowe's lips pulled back from his teeth as he switched off. He snatched a candy bar out of his drawer, tore the film part way off, then threw it back in the drawer as his desk phone chimed. Here, Chris. Here, Mr. Marlowe. Look, Chris, has Holliday left Earth yet? Yes, sir. Yes, Dave. Where is he? Luna, en route to Karlshaven. He was lucky enough to have me arrange for his accidentally getting a ride on a GenServe ship that happened to be going that way, if you follow me. Meade grinned. Get him back. The smile blanked out. I can't do that, Mr. Marlowe. He'd never be able to take it. You should have seen him when I put him on the shuttle. We doped him up with Easy Rest, and even then his subconscious could feel the bulkheads around him, even in his sleep. Those shuttles are small, and they don't have ports. We can't help that. We need him, and I've got to talk to him first, personally. Meade bit his lip. Yes, sir. Dave. Yes, Dave. Section 7. Dalish ud Klavan sat easily in his chair opposite Marlowe. He rested one digit on his notebook and waited. Ud Klavan, Marlowe said amiably, you're undoubtedly aware by now that your opposite number on Dovenil has been charged with a civil crime and deported. The Dovenilid nodded. An unfortunate incident, one that I regret personally and which I am sure my own people would much rather not have had happened. Naturally, Marlowe smiled. I simply wanted to reassure you that this incident does not reflect on your own status in any way. We are investigating our representative and will take appropriate action, but it seems quite clear that the fault is not with your people. We have already forwarded reparations and a note of apology to your government. As further reparation, I wish to assure you personally that we will cooperate with your personal observations in every possible way. If there is anything at all you wish to know, even what might under ordinary conditions be considered restricted information, just call on us. Ud Klavan's chest stirred a fraction of an inch, and Marlowe chuckled inwardly. Well, even a brilliant spy might be forgiven an outward display of surprise under these circumstances. The Dovenilid gave him a piercing look, but Marlowe presented a featureless facade of bulk. The secretary chuckled in his mind once more. He doubted if Ud Klavan could accept the hypothesis that Marlowe did not know he was a spy, but the Dovenilid must be a sorely confused being at this point. Thank you, Marlowe, he said finally. I am most grateful, and I am sure my people will construe it as yet another sign of the Union's friendship. I hope so, Ud Klavan, Marlowe replied. Having exchanged this last friendly lie, they went through the customary Dovenilid formula of leave-taking. Marlowe slapped his interphone switch as soon as the alien was gone. Mary, what's the latest on Holiday? His shuttle lands at Idlewild in half an hour, sir. All right. Get Mr. Meade, have him meet me out front, and get an official car to take us to the field. I'll want somebody from Emigration to go with us. Call Idlewild and have them set up a desk and chairs for 4 out in the middle of the field. Call the Ministry for Traffic and make sure that field stays clear until we're through with it. My ministerial prerogative. And no backtalk. I want that car in 10 minutes. Yes, sir. Mary's voice was perfectly even, without the slightest hint that there was anything unusual happening. Marlowe switched off and twisted his mouth. He picked up the GenServe on the Dovenil area and began skimming it rapidly. He kept his eyes carefully front as he walked out of his office, past the battery of clerks in the outer office, and down the hall. He kept them rigidly fixed on the door of his personal elevator, which, during the day, was human-operated under the provisions of the Human Employment Act of 2302. He met Meade in front of the building and did not look into the eyes of Boussard, the man from Emigration, as they shook hands. He followed them down the walk in a sweating agony of obliviousness and climbed into the car with carefully normal lack of haste. He sat sweating, chewing a candy bar for several minutes before he spoke. Then, slowly, he felt his battered defenses reassert themselves, and he could actually look at Boussard before he turned to Meade. Now then, he rapped out a shade too abruptly before he caught himself. Here's the GenServe on the Dovenil area, Chris. Anything in it you don't know already? I don't think so, sir. Okay. Dig me up a habitable planet. Even a long-term false E will do. Close to Dovenil, but not actually in their system if it's at all possible. I want that world in a system without any rich planets, and I don't want any rich systems anywhere near it. If you can't do that, arrange for the outright sale of all mineral and other resource rights to suitable companies. I want that planet to be habitable, but I want it to be impossible for any people on it to get at enough resources to achieve a technological culture. Can do? Meade shook his head. I don't know. You've got about 15 minutes to find out. I'm going to start talking to Holiday, and when I tell him I've got another planet for him, I'll be depending on you to furnish one. Sorry to pile it on like this, but must be. Meade nodded. Right, Mr. Marlowe. That's why I draw pay. Good boy. Now, Boussard, I want you to be ready to lay out a complete advertising and prospectus program. Straight routine work, but about 4 times normal speed. The toughest part of it will be following the lead that Chris and I set. Don't be surprised at anything, and act like it happens every day. Yes, Mr. Marlowe. Right. Boussard looked uncomfortable. Mr. Marlowe? Yes? About this man, Harrison. I presume all this is the result of what happened to him on Dovenil. Do you think there's any foundation in truth for what they say he did, or do you think it's just an excuse to get him off their world?" Marlowe looked at him coldly. "Don't be an ass," he snorted. Section 8. Martin Holliday climbed slowly out of the shuttle's lock and moved fumblingly down the stairs, leaning on the attendant's arm. His face was a mottled gray, and his hands shook uncontrollably. He stepped down the tarmac, and his head turned from side to side as his eyes gulped the field's distances. Marlowe sat behind the desk that had been put down the middle of this emptiness, his eyes brooding as he looked at Holliday. Bussard stood beside him, trying nervously to appear noncommittal, while Meade went up to the shaking old man, grasped his hand, and brought him over to the desk. Marlowe shifted uncomfortably. The desk was standard size, and he had to sit far away from it. He could not feel at ease in such a position. His thick fingers went into the side pocket of his jacket, and he peeled the film off a candy bar, and he began to eat it, holding it in his left hand as Meade introduced Holliday. "How do you do, Mr. Holliday?" Marlowe said, his voice higher than he would have liked it, while he shook the man's hand. I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Secretary," Holliday replied. His eyes were darting past Marlowe's head. "This is Mr. Bussard of Emigration, and you know Mr. Meade, of course. Now I think we can all sit down." Meade's chair was next to Holliday's, and Bussard's was to one side of the desk, so that only Marlowe unavoidably blocked his complete view of the stretching tarmac. "First of all, Mr. Holliday, I'd like to thank you for coming back. Please believe me when I say we would not have made such a request if it were not urgently necessary." "It's all right," Holliday said in a low, apologetic voice. "I don't mind." Marlowe winced, but he had to go on. "Have you seen a news broadcast recently, Mr. Holliday?" The man shook his head in embarrassment. "No, sir. I've been asleep most of the time." "I understand, Mr. Holliday. I didn't really expect you had, under the circumstances. The situation is this. Some time ago our survey ships, working out in their usual expanding pattern, encountered an alien civilization on a world designated Moore II on our maps, and which the natives called Dovenil. It was largely a routine matter, no different from any other alien contact which we've had. They had a relatively high technology, embracing the beginnings of interplanetary flight, and our contact teams were soon able to work out a diplomatic status mutually satisfactory to both. Social observers were exchanged in accordance with the usual practice, and everything seemed to be going well." Holliday nodded out of painful politeness, not seeing the connection with himself. Some of his nervousness was beginning to fade, but it was impossible for him to be really at ease with so many people near him, with all of Earth's billions lurking at the edge of the tarmac. "However," Marlowe went on as quickly as he could, "today our representative was deported on a trumped-up charge. Undoubtedly this is only the first move in some complicated scheme directed against the Union. What it is, we do not yet know, but further observation of the actions of their own representative on this planet has convinced us that they are a clever, ruthless people, living in a society which would have put Machiavelli to shame. They are single-minded of purpose, and welded into a tight group whose major purpose in life is the service of the state in its major purpose, which, by all indications, is that of eventually dominating the universe. You know our libertarian society. You know that the Union government is almost powerless, and that the Union itself is nothing but a loose federation composed of a large number of independent nations tied together by very little more than the fact that we are all Earthmen. We are almost helpless in the face of such a nation as the Dovenilids. They have already outmaneuvered us once. Despite our best efforts, there is no sign that they will not be able to do so again, at will. We must somehow discover what the Dovenilids intend to do next. For this reason, I earnestly request that you accept our offer of another planet than the one you have optioned, closer to the Dovenilid system. We are willing, under these extraordinary circumstances, to consider your credit sufficient for the outright purchase of half the planet, and Mr. Bussard here will do his utmost to get you suitable colonists for the other half as rapidly as it can be done. Will you help us, Mr. Holliday?" Marlowe sank back in his chair. He became conscious of a messy feeling in his left hand, and looked down to discover the half-eaten candy bar had melted. He tried furtively to wipe his hand on the underside of the desk, but he knew Bussard had noticed, and he cringed and cursed himself. Holliday's face twisted nervously. I don't know." "Please don't misunderstand us, Mr. Holliday," Marlowe said. "We do not intend to ask you to spy for us, nor are we acting with the intention of now establishing a base of any sort on the planet. We simply would like to have a Union world near the Dovenilid system. Whatever Dovenil does will not have gathered significant momentum by the end of your life. You will be free to end your days exactly as you have always wished, and the precautions we have outlined will ensure that there will be no encroachments on your personal property during that time. We are planning for the next generation, when Dovenil will be initiating its program of expansion. It is then that we will need an established outpost near their borders." "Yes," Holliday said hesitantly. "I can understand that. I don't know," he repeated. "It seems all right, and as you say, it won't matter during my lifetime, and it's more than I had really hoped for." He looked nervously at Meade. "What do you think, Mr. Meade? You've always done your best for me." Meade shot one quick glance at Marlowe. "I think Mr. Marlowe's doing his best for the Union," he said finally, "and I know he is fully aware of your personal interests. I think what he's doing is reasonable under the circumstances, and I think his proposition to you, as he's outlined it, is something which you cannot afford to not consider. The final decision is up to you, of course." Holliday nodded slowly, staring down at his hands. Yes, I think you're right, Mr. Meade." He looked up at Marlowe. "I'll be glad to help, and I'm grateful for the consideration you've shown me." "Not at all, Mr. Holliday. The Union is in your debt." Marlowe wiped his hand on the underside of the desk again, but he only made matters worse, for his fingers picked up some of the chocolate he had removed before. "Mr. Meade, will you give Mr. Holliday the details on the new planet?" he said, trying to get his handkerchief out without smearing his suit. He could almost hear Bussard snickering. Holliday signed the new option contract and shook Marlowe's hand. "I'd like to thank you again, sir. Looking at it from my point of view, it's something for nothing, at least while I'm alive. And it's a very nice planet, too, from the way Mr. Meade described it. Even better than Karlshaven." "Nevertheless, Mr. Holliday," Marlowe said, "you have done the Union a great service. We would consider it an honor if you allowed us to enter your planet in our records under the name of Holliday." He kept his eyes away from Meade. Martin Holliday's eyes were shining. "Thank you, Mr. Marlowe," he said huskily. Marlowe could think of no reply. Finally he simply nodded. "It's been a pleasure meeting you, Mr. Holliday. We've arranged transportation, and your shuttle will be taking off very shortly." Holliday's face began to bead with fresh perspiration at the thought of bulkheads enclosing him once more, but he managed to smile, and then ask hesitantly, May I wait for the shuttle out here, sir?" "Certainly. We'll arrange for that. Well, goodbye, Mr. Holliday." "Goodbye, Mr. Marlowe. Goodbye, Mr. Bussard. And goodbye, Mr. Meade. I don't suppose you'll be seeing me again." "Good luck, Mr. Holliday," Meade said. Marlowe twisted awkwardly on the car's back seat, wiping futilely at the long smear of chocolate on his trouser pocket. Well, he thought at least he'd given the old man his name on the star maps until Earthmen stopped roving. At least he'd given him that. Meade was looking at him. "I don't suppose we've got time to let him die in peace, have we?" he asked. Marlowe shook his head. "I suppose we'll have to start breaking him immediately, won't we?" Marlowe nodded. "I'll get at it right away, sir." "Dave, does everyone have to hate me? Can't anyone understand? Even you, Creed? Even you, Meade?" Section 9. Dalish ud Klavan, stooped and withered, sat hopelessly opposite Marlowe, who sat behind his desk like a grizzled polar bear, his thinning mane of white hair unkempt and straggling. "Marlowe, my people are strangling," the old Dovenilid said. Marlowe looked at him silently. "The Holliday Republic has signed treaty after treaty with us, and still their citizens raid our mining planets, drive away our own people, stealing the resources we must have if we are to live." Marlowe sighed. "There's nothing I can do." "We have gone to the Holliday government repeatedly," ud Klavan pleaded. "They tell us the raiders are criminals, that they are doing their best to stop them, but they still buy the metal the raiders bring them." "They have to," Marlowe said. "There are no available resources anywhere within practicable distances. If they're to have any civilization at all, they've got to buy from the outlaws." "But they are members of the Union," ud Klavan protested. "Why won't you do anything to stop them?" "We can't," Marlowe said again. "They're members of the Union, yes, but they're also a free republic. We have no administrative jurisdiction over them, and if we attempted to establish one, our citizens would rise in protest all over our territory." "Then we're finished. Dovenil is a dead world." Marlowe nodded slowly. "I am very sorry. If there is anything I can do, or that the Ministry can do, we will do it. But we cannot save the Dovenilid state." Ud Klavan looked at him bitterly. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for your generous offer of a gracious funeral." "I don't understand you," he burst out suddenly. "I don't understand you people. Diplomatic lies, yes. Expediency, yes. But this madness, this fanatical, illogical devotion of the state in the cause of a people who will tolerate no state. No, this I cannot understand." Marlowe looked at him, his eyes full of years. "Ud Klavan," he said, "you are quite right. We are a race of maniacs, and that is why Earthmen rule the galaxy. For our treaties are not binding and our promises are worthless. Our government does not represent our people. It represents our people as they once were. The delay in the democratic process is such that the treaty signed today fulfills the promise of yesterday. But today the body politic has formed a new opinion, is following a new logic which is completely at variance with that of yesterday. An Earthman's promise, expressed in words or deeds, is good only at the instant he makes it. A second later, new factors have entered into the total circumstances, and a new chain of logic has formed in his head, to be altered again a few seconds later." He thought suddenly of that poor claustrophobic devil, Holiday, harried from planet to planet, never given a moment's rest, and civilizing, spreading the race of humankind wherever he was driven, civilizing with a fervor no hired dummy could have accomplished, driven by his fear to sell with all the real estate agent's talent that had been born in him, selling for the sake of money with which to buy that land he needed for his peace, and always being forced to sell a little too much. Ud Klavan rose from his chair. "You are also right, Marlowe. You are a race of maniacs, gibbering across the stars, and know, Marlowe, that the other races of the universe hate you." Marlowe, with a tremendous effort, heaved himself out of his chair. "Hate us?" He lumbered around the desk and advanced on the frightened Dovenilid, who was retreating backwards before his path. "Can't you see it? Don't you understand that if we are to pursue any course of action over a long time, if we are ever going to achieve a galaxy in which an Earthman can some day live at peace with himself, we must each day violate all the moral codes and creeds which we held inviolate the day before? That we must fight against every ideal, every principle which our fathers taught us, because they no longer apply to our new logic? You hate us." He thrust his fat hand, its nails bitten down to the quick and beyond, in front of the cringing alien's eyes. "You poor, weak, single-minded, ineffectual thing. We hate ourselves." The Defenders, by Philip K. Dick. No weapon has ever been frightful enough to put a stop to war, perhaps because we never before had any that thought for themselves. Taylor sat back in his chair, reading the morning newspaper. The warm kitchen and the smell of coffee blended with the comfort of not having to go to work. This was his rest period, the first for a long time, and he was glad of it. He folded the second section back, sighing with contentment. "What is it?" Mary said from the stove. "They pasted Moscow again last night." Taylor nodded his head in approval. "Gave it a real pounding. One of those RH bombs. It's about time." He nodded again, feeling the full comfort of the kitchen, the presence of his plump, attractive wife, the breakfast dishes and coffee. This was relaxation. And the war news was good and satisfying. He could feel a justifiable glow at the news, a sense of pride and personal accomplishment. After all, he was an integral part of the war program. Not just another factory worker lugging a cart of scrap, but a technician, one of those who designed and planned the nerve trunk of the war. "It says they have the new subs almost perfected. Wait until they get those going." He smacked his lips with anticipation. "When they start shelling from underwater, the Soviets are sure going to be surprised." "They're doing a wonderful job," Mary agreed vaguely. "Do you know what we saw today? Our team is getting a leady to show to the school children. I saw the leady, but only for a moment. It's good for the children to see what their contributions are going for, don't you think?" She looked around at him. "A leady," Taylor murmured. He put the newspaper down slowly. "Well, make sure it's decontaminated properly. We don't want to take any chances." "Oh, they always bathe them when they're brought down from the surface," Mary said. "They wouldn't think of letting them down without the bath, would they?" She hesitated, thinking back. "Don, you know, it makes me remember." He nodded. "I know." He knew what she was thinking.
Once in the very first weeks of the war, before everyone had been evacuated from the surface, they had seen a hospital train discharging the wounded, people who had been showered with sleet. He remembered the way they had looked, the expression on their faces, or as much of their faces as was left. It had not been a pleasant sight. There had been a lot of that at first, in the early days, before the transfer to undersurface was complete. There had been a lot, and it hadn't been very difficult to come across. Taylor looked up at his wife. She was thinking too much about it. The last few months, they all were. "Forget it," he said. "It's all in the past. There isn't anybody up there now but the Leadys, and they don't mind." "But just the same, I hope they're careful when they let one of them down here. If one were still hot." He laughed, pushing himself away from the table. "Forget it. This is a wonderful moment. I'll be home for the next 2 shifts. Nothing to do but sit around and take things easy. Maybe we can take in a show, okay?" "A show? Do we have to? I don't like to look at all the destruction, the ruins. Sometimes I see some place I remember, like San Francisco. They showed a shot of San Francisco, the bridge broken and fallen in the water, and I got upset. I don't like to watch." "But don't you want to know what's going on? No human beings are getting hurt, you know." "But it's so awful." Her face was set and strained. "Please, no, Don." Don Taylor picked up his newspaper sullenly. "All right, but there isn't a hell of a lot else to do. And don't forget, their cities are getting it even worse." She nodded. Taylor turned the rough, thin sheets of newspaper. His good mood had soured on him. Why did she have to fret all the time? They were pretty well off as things went. You couldn't expect to have everything perfect, living undersurface with an artificial sun and artificial food. Naturally, it was a strain not seeing the sky or being able to go any place or see anything other than metal walls, great roaring factories, the plant yards, and barracks, but it was better than being on the surface. And someday it would end and they could return. Nobody wanted to live this way, but it was necessary. He turned the page angrily, and the poor paper ripped. Damn it! The paper was getting worse quality all the time. Bad print, yellow tint. Well, they needed everything for the war program. He ought to know that. Wasn't he one of the planners? He excused himself and went into the other room. The bed was still unmade. They had better get it in shape before the 7th-hour inspection. There was a 1-unit fine. The vidphone rang. He halted. Who would it be? He went over and clicked it on. "Taylor?" the face said, forming into place. It was an old face, gray and grim. "This is Moss. I'm sorry to bother you during rest period, but this thing has come up." He rattled papers. "I want you to hurry over here." Taylor stiffened. "What is it? There's no chance it could wait?" The calm gray eyes were studying him, expressionless, unjudging. "If you want me to come down to the lab," Taylor grumbled, "I suppose I can. I'll get my uniform." "No. Come as you are, and not to the lab. Meet me at the 2nd stage as soon as possible. It'll take you about a half an hour using the fast car up. I'll see you there." The picture broke and Moss disappeared. "What was it?" Mary said at the door. "Moss. He wants me for something." "I knew this would happen." "Well, you didn't want to do anything anyhow. What does it matter?" His voice was bitter. "It's all the same every day. I'll bring you back something. I'm going up to 2nd stage. Maybe I'll be close enough to the surface to—" Don't bring me anything. Not from the surface." "All right, I won't. But of all the irrational nonsense—" She watched him put on his boots without answering. Moss nodded, and Taylor fell in step with him as the older man strode along. A series of loads were going up to the surface, blind cars clanking like ore trucks up the ramp, disappearing through the stage trap above them. Taylor watched the cars, heavy with tubular machinery of some sort, weapons new to him. Workers were everywhere in the dark gray uniforms of the labor corps, loading, lifting, shouting back and forth. The stage was deafening with noise. "We'll go up a way," Moss said, "where we can talk. This is no place to give you details." They took an escalator up. The commercial lift fell behind them, and with it most of the crashing and booming. Suspended on the side of the tube, the vast tunnel leading to the surface, not more than half a mile above them now. "My God," Taylor said, looking down the tube involuntarily. "It's a long way down." Moss laughed. "Don't look." They opened a door and entered an office. Behind the desk an officer was sitting, an officer of internal security. He looked up. "I'll be right with you, Moss." He gazed at Taylor, studying him. "You're a little ahead of time." "This is Commander Franks," Moss said to Taylor. "He was the first to make the discovery. I was notified last night." He tapped a parcel he carried. "I was let in because of this." Franks frowned at him and stood up. "We're going up to first stage. We can discuss it there." "First stage?" Taylor repeated nervously. The three of them went down a side passage to a small lift. "I've never been up there. Is it all right? It's not radioactive, is it?" "You're like everyone else," Frank said. "Old women afraid of burglars. No radiation leaks down to first stage. There's lead and rock, and what comes down the tube is bathed." "What's the nature of the problem?" Taylor asked. "I'd like to know something about it." "In a moment." They entered the lift and ascended. When they stepped out, they were in a hall of soldiers, weapons and uniforms everywhere. Taylor blinked in surprise. So this was first stage, the closest undersurface level to the top. After this stage was only rock, lead and rock, and the great tubes leading up like the burrows of earthworms. Lead and rock, and above that, where the tubes opened, the great expanse that no living being had seen for 8 years. The vast, endless ruin that had once been man's home. The place where he had lived 8 years ago. Now the surface was a lethal desert of slag and rolling clouds. Endless clouds drifted back and forth, blotting out the red sun. Occasionally something metallic stirred, moving through the remains of the city, threading its way across the tortured terrain of the countryside. A leady, a surface robot, immune to radiation, constructed with feverish haste in the last month before the Cold War became literally hot. Leadys crawling along the ground, moving over the oceans or through the skies in slender blackened craft. Creatures that could exist where no life could remain. Metal and plastic figures that waged a war man had conceived, but which he could not fight himself. Human beings had invented war, invented and manufactured the weapons, even invented the players, the fighters, the actors of the war. But they themselves could not venture forth, could not wage it themselves. In all the world, in Russia, in Europe, America, Africa, no living human being remained. They were under the surface, in the deep shelters that had been carefully planned and built even as the first bombs began to fall. It was a brilliant idea, and the only idea that could have worked. Up above, on the ruined, blasted surface of what had once been a living planet, the leady crawled and scurried and fought man's war. And undersurface, in the depths of the planet, human beings toiled endlessly to produce the weapons to continue the fight, month by month, year by year. "First stage," Taylor said. A strange ache went through him. "Almost to the surface." "But not quite," Moss said. Franks led them through the soldiers over to one side near the lip of the tube. "In a few minutes a lift will bring something down to us from the surface," he explained. "You see, Taylor, every once in a while security examines and interrogates a surface leady, one that has been above for a time, to find out certain things. A vidcall is sent up and contact is made with a field headquarters. We need this direct interview. We can't depend on vidscreen contact alone. The leadies are doing a good job, but we want to make certain that everything is going the way we want it." Franks faced Taylor and Moss and continued. "The lift will bring down a leady from the surface. One of the A-class leadies. There's an examination chamber in the next room with a lead wall in the center, so the interviewing officer won't be exposed to radiation. We find this easier than bathing the leady. It is going right back up. It has a job to get back to. 2 days ago, an A-class leady was brought down and interrogated. I conducted the session myself. We were interested in a new weapon the Soviets have been using, an automatic mine that pursues anything that moves. Military had sent instructions up that the mine be observed and reported in detail. This A-class leady was brought down with information. We learned a few facts from it, obtained the usual roll of film and reports, and then sent it back up. It was going out of the chamber back to the lift when a curious thing happened. At the time I thought—" Franks broke off. A red light was flashing. "That downlift is coming." He nodded to some soldiers. "Let's enter the chamber. The leady will be along in a moment." "An A-class leady," Taylor said. "I've seen them on the show screens making their reports." "It's quite an experience," Moss said. "They're almost human." They entered the chamber and seated themselves behind the lead wall. After a time a signal was flashed, and Franks made a motion with his hands. The door beyond the wall opened. Taylor peered through his view slot. He saw something advancing slowly, a slender metallic figure moving on a tread, its arm grips at rest by its sides. The figure halted and scanned the lead wall. It stood waiting. "We're interested in learning something," Frank said. "Before I question you, do you have anything to report on surface conditions?"
"No. The war continues." The leady's voice was automatic and toneless. "We are a little short of fast pursuit craft, the single-seat type. We could use also some—"
"That has all been noted. What I want to ask you is this. Our contact with you has been through vidscreen only. We must rely on indirect evidence, since none of us goes above. We can only infer what is going on. We never see anything ourselves. We have to take it all second-hand. Some top leaders are beginning to think there's too much room for error."
"Error?" the leady asked. "In what way? Our reports are checked carefully before they're sent down. We maintain constant contact with you. Everything of value is reported. Any new weapons which the enemy is seen to employ—"
"I realize that," Franks grunted behind his peep slot. "But perhaps we should see it all for ourselves. Is it possible that there might be a large enough radiation-free area for a human party to ascend to the surface? If a few of us were to come up in lead-lined suits, would we be able to survive long enough to observe conditions and watch things?" The machine hesitated before answering.
"I doubt it. You can check air samples, of course, and decide for yourselves. But in the 8 years since you left, things have continually worsened. You cannot have any real idea of conditions up there. It has become difficult for any moving object to survive for long. There are many kinds of projectiles sensitive to movement. The new mine not only reacts to motion, but continues to pursue the object indefinitely, until it finally reaches it. And the radiation is everywhere." "I see." Franks turned to Moss, his eyes narrowed oddly. "Well, that was what I wanted to know. You may go." The machine moved back towards its exit. It paused. "Each month the amount of lethal particles in the atmosphere increases. The tempo of the war is gradually—"
"I understand." Franks rose. He held out his hand, and Moss passed him the package. One thing before you leave. I want you to examine a new type of metal shield material. I'll pass you a sample with the tong." Franks put the package in the toothed grip and revolved the tong so that he held the other end. The package swung down to the leady, which took it. They watched it unwrap the package and take the metal plate in its hands. The leady turned the metal over and over. Suddenly, it became rigid. "All right," Franks said. He put his shoulder against the wall and a section slid aside. Taylor gasped. Franks and Moss were hurrying up to the leady. "Good God," Taylor said. "But it's radioactive!" The leady stood unmoving, still holding the metal. Soldiers appeared in the chamber. They surrounded the leady and ran a counter across it carefully. "Okay, sir," one of them said to Franks. "It's as cold as a long winter evening." "Good. I was sure, but I didn't want to take any chances." "You see," Moss said to Taylor, "this leady isn't hot at all. Yet it came directly from the surface, without even being bathed." "But what does it mean?" Taylor asked blankly. "It may be an accident," Franks said. "There's always the possibility that a given object might escape being exposed above, but this is the second time it's happened that we know of. There may be others." "The second time?" "The previous interview was when we noticed it. The leady was not hot. It was cold, too, like this one." Moss took back the metal plate from the leady's hands. He pressed the surface carefully and returned it to the stiff, unprotesting fingers. "We shorted it out with this so we could get close enough for a thorough check. It'll come back on in a second now. We had better get behind the wall again." They walked back and the lead wall swung closed behind them. The soldiers left the chamber. "2 periods from now," Frank said softly, "an initial investigating party will be ready to go surface side. We're going up the tube in suits, up to the top. The first human party to leave undersurface in 8 years." "It may mean nothing," Moss said, "but I doubt it. Something's going on, something strange. The leady told us no life could exist above without being roasted. The story doesn't fit." Taylor nodded. He stared through the peep slot at the immobile metal figure. Already the leady was beginning to stir. It was bent in several places, dented and twisted, and its finish was blackened and charred. It was a leady that had been up there a long time. It had seen war and destruction. ruin so vast that no human being could imagine the extent. It had crawled and slunk in a world of radiation and death, a world where no life could exist. And Taylor had touched it. "You're going with us," Frank said suddenly. "I want you along. I think the three of us will go." Mary faced him with a sick and frightened expression. "I know it. You're going to the surface, aren't you?" She followed him into the kitchen. Taylor sat down, looking away from her. "It's a classified project," he evaded. "I can't tell you anything about it." "You don't have to tell me. I know. I knew at the moment you came in. There was something on your face, something I haven't seen there for a long, long time. It was an old look." She came toward him. "But how can they send you to the surface?" She took his face in her shaking hands, making him look at her. There was a strange hunger in her eyes. "Nobody can live up there. Look at this." She grabbed up a newspaper and held it in front of him. "Look at this photograph. America, Europe, Asia, Africa. Nothing but ruins. We've seen it every day on the show screens. All destroyed, poisoned. And they're sending you up? Why? No living thing can get by up there. Not even a weed or grass. They've wrecked the surface, haven't they? Haven't they?" Taylor stood up. "It's an order. I know nothing about it. I was told to report to join a scout party. That's all I know." He stood for a long time, staring ahead. Slowly he reached for the newspaper and held it up to the light. "It looks real," he murmured. "Ruins, deadness, slag. It's convincing. All the reports, photographs, films, even air samples. Yet we haven't seen it for ourselves, not after the first months." "What are you talking about?" "Nothing." He put the paper down. "I'm leaving early after the next sleep period. Let's turn in." Mary turned away. Her face was hard and harsh. "Do what you want. We might just as well all go up and get killed at once instead of dying slowly down here like vermin in the ground." He had not realized how resentful she was. Were they all like that? How about the workers toiling in the factories day and night endlessly? The pale, stooped men and women plodding back and forth to work, blinking in the colorless light, eating synthetics. "You shouldn't be so bitter," he said. Mary smiled a little. "I'm bitter because I know you'll never come back." She turned away. "I'll never see you again once you go up there." He was shocked. "What? How can you say a thing like that?" She did not answer. He awakened with the public newscaster screeching in his ears, shouting outside the building. "Special news bulletin. Surface forces report enormous Soviet attack with new weapons. Retreat of key groups. All work units report to factories at once." Taylor blinked, rubbing his eyes. He jumped out of bed and hurried to the vidphone. A moment later he was put through to Moss. "Listen," he said. "What about this new attack? Is the project off?" He could see Moss's desk, covered with reports and papers. "No," Moss said. "We're going right ahead. Get over here at once." "But—" "Don't argue with me." Moss held up a handful of surface bulletins, crumpling them savagely. "This is a fake. Come on." He broke off. Taylor dressed furiously, his mind in a daze. Half an hour later he leaped from a fast car and hurried up the stairs into the synthetics building. The corridors were full of men and women rushing in every direction. He entered Moss's office. "There you are," Moss said, getting up immediately. "Franks is waiting for us at the outgoing station." They went in a security car, the sirens screaming. Workers scattered out of their way. "What about the attack?" Taylor asked. Moss braced his shoulders. "We're certain that we've forced their hand. We've brought the issue to a head." They pulled up at the station link of the tube and leaped out. A moment later they were moving up at high speed toward the first stage. They emerged into a bewildering scene of activity. Soldiers were fastening on lead suits, talking excitedly to each other, shouting back and forth. Guns were being given out, instructions passed. Taylor studied one of the soldiers. He was armed with the dreaded Bender pistol, the new snub-nosed hand weapon that was just beginning to come from the assembly line. Some of the soldiers looked a little frightened. "I hope we're not making a mistake," Moss said, noticing his gaze. Franks came towards them. "Here's the program. The three of us are going up first, alone. The soldiers will follow in 15 minutes. "What are we going to tell the leadys?" Taylor worriedly asked. "We'll have to tell them something." "We want to observe the new Soviet attack," Franks smiled ironically. "Since it seems to be so serious, we should be there in person to witness it." "And then what?" Taylor said. "That'll be up to them. Let's go." In a small car they went swiftly up the tube, carried by anti-grav beams from below. Taylor glanced down from time to time. It was a long way back, and getting longer each moment. He sweated nervously inside his suit, gripping his Bender pistol with inexpert fingers. Why had they chosen him? Chance. Pure chance. Moss had asked him to come along as a department member. Then Franks had picked him out on the spur of the moment. And now they were rushing toward the surface, faster and faster. A deep fear instilled in him for 8 years throbbed in his mind. Radiation, certain death, a world blasted and lethal. Up and up the car went. Taylor gripped the sides and closed his eyes. Each moment they were closer. The first living creatures to go above the first stage, up the tube past the lead and rock, up to the surface. The phobic horror shook him in waves. It was death. They all knew that. Hadn't they seen it in the films 1,000 times? The cities, the sleet coming down, the rolling clouds. "It won't be much longer," Frank said. "We're almost there. The surface tower is not expecting us. I gave orders that no signal was to be sent." The car shot up, rushing furiously. Taylor's head spun. He hung on, his eyes shut, up and up. The car stopped. He opened his eyes. They were in a vast room, fluorescent lit, a cavern filled with equipment and machinery, endless mounds of material piled in row after row. Among the stacks, leadys were working silently, pushing trucks and handcarts. "Leadys," Moss said. His face was pale. "Then we're really on the surface." The leadys were going back and forth with equipment moving the vast stores of guns and spare parts, ammunition and supplies that had been brought to the surface. And this was the receiving station for only one tube. There were many others scattered throughout the continent. Taylor looked nervously around him. They were really there, above ground, on the surface. This was where the war was. "Come on," Frank said. "A B-class guard is coming our way." They stepped out of the car. A leady was approaching them rapidly. It coasted up in front of them and stopped, scanning them with its hand weapons raised. "This is security," Frank said. "Have an A-class sent to me at once." The leady hesitated. Other B-class guards were coming, scooting across the floor, alert and alarmed. Moss peered around. "Obey," Frank said in a loud, commanding voice. "You've been ordered." The leady moved uncertainly away from them. At the end of the building, the door slid back. 2 A-class leadys appeared, coming slowly toward them. Each had a green stripe across its front. "From the Surface Council," Franks whispered tensely. "This is above ground. All right. Get set." The 2 leadys approached warily, without speaking. They stopped close by the men, looking them up and down. "I'm Franks of security. We came from the undersurface in order to—" "This is incredible," one of the leadys interrupted him coldly. "You know you can't live up here. The whole surface is lethal to you. You can't possibly remain on the surface." "These suits will protect us," Frank said. "In any case, it's not your responsibility. What I want is an immediate council meeting so I can acquaint myself with conditions, with the situation here. Can that be arranged?" "You human beings can't survive up here, and the new Soviet attack is directed at this area. It is in considerable danger." "We know that. Please assemble the council." Franks looked around him at the vast room lit by recessed lamps in the ceiling. An uncertain quality came into his voice. "Is it night or day right now?" "Night," one of the A-class leadys said after a pause. "Dawn is coming in about 2 hours." Franks nodded. "We'll remain at least 2 hours then. As a concession to our sentimentality, would you please show us some place where we can observe the sun as it comes up? We would appreciate it." A stir went through the leadys. "It is an unpleasant sight," one of the leadys said. "You've seen the photographs. You know what you'll witness. Clouds of drifting particles blot out the light. Slag heaps are everywhere. The whole land is destroyed. For you it will be a staggering sight, much worse than pictures and film can convey." "However it may be, we'll stay long enough to see it. Will you give the order to the council?" "Come this way." Reluctantly, the 2 leadys coasted toward the wall of the warehouse. The 3 men trudged after them, their heavy shoes ringing against the concrete. At the wall, the 2 leadys paused. "This is the entrance to the council chamber. There are windows in the chamber room, but it is still dark outside, of course. You'll see nothing right now, but in 2 hours." "Open the door," Frank said. The door slid back. They went slowly inside. The room was small, a neat room with a round table in the center, chairs ringing it. The 3 of them sat down silently, and the two leadys followed after them, taking their places.
"The other council members are on their way. They have already been notified and are coming as quickly as they can. Again, I urge you to go back down." The leady surveyed the three human beings. "There is no way you can meet the conditions up here. Even we survive with some trouble ourselves. How can you expect to do it?" The leader approached Franks. "This astonishes and perplexes us," it said. "Of course we must do what you tell us, but allow me to point out that if you remain here—" "We know," Franks said impatiently. "However, we intend to remain at least until sunrise." "If you insist." There was silence. The leadys seemed to be conferring with each other, although the three men heard no sound. "For your own good," the leader said at last, "you must go back down. We have discussed this, and it seems to us that you are doing the wrong thing for your own good." "We are human beings," Franks said sharply. "Don't you understand? We're men, not machines." "That is precisely why you must go back. This room is radioactive. All surface areas are. We calculate that your suits will not protect you for over 50 more minutes. Therefore—" The leadys moved abruptly toward the men, wheeling in a circle, forming a solid row. The men stood up, Taylor reaching awkwardly for his weapon, his fingers numb and stupid. The men stood facing the silent metal figures. "We must insist," the leader said, its voice without emotion. "We must take you back to the tube and send you down on the next car. I am sorry, but it is necessary."
"What'll we do?" Moss said nervously to Franks. He touched his gun. "Shall we blast 'em?" Franks shook his head. "All right," he said to the leader. "We'll go back." He moved toward the door, motioning Taylor and Moss to follow him. They looked at him in surprise, but they came with him. The leadys followed them out into the great warehouse. Slowly they moved toward the tube entrance, none of them speaking. At the lip, Franks turned. "We're going back because we have no choice. There are 3 of us and about a dozen of you. However, if—" "Here comes a car," Taylor said. There was a grating sound from the tube. D-class leadys moved toward the edge to receive it. "I am sorry," the leader said, "but it is for your protection. We are watching over you, literally. You must stay below and let us conduct the war. In a sense, it has come to be our war. We must fight it as we see fit." The car rose to the surface. 12 soldiers armed with Bender pistols stepped from it and surrounded the 3 men. Moss breathed a sigh of relief. "Well, this does change things. It came off just right." The leader moved back, away from the soldiers. It studied them intently, glancing from one to the next, apparently trying to make up its mind. At last it made a sign to the other leadys. They coasted aside, and a corridor was opened up towards the warehouse. "Even now," the leader said, "we could send you back by force. But it is evident that this is not really an observation party at all. These soldiers show that you have much more in mind. This was all carefully prepared." "Very carefully," Franks said. They closed in. "How much more we can only guess. I must admit that we were taken unprepared. We failed utterly to meet the situation. Now force would be absurd, because neither side can afford to injure the other. We, because of the restrictions placed on us regarding human life. You, because the war demands—" The soldiers fired, quick and in fright. Moss dropped to one knee, firing up. The leader dissolved in a cloud of particles. On all sides, D and B-class leadys were rushing up, some with weapons, some with metal slats. The room was in confusion. Off in the distance a siren was screaming. Franks and Taylor were cut off from the others, separated from the soldiers by a wall of metal bodies. "They can't fire back," Franks said calmly. "This is another bluff. They've tried to bluff us all the way." He fired into the face of a leady. The leady dissolved. "They can only try to frighten us. Remember that." They went on firing, and leady after leady vanished. The room reeked with the smell of burning metal, the stink of fused plastic and steel. Taylor had been knocked down. He was struggling to find his gun, reaching wildly among metal legs, groping frantically to find it. His fingers strained, a handle swam in front of him. Suddenly something came down on his arm, a metal foot. He cried out. Then it was over. The leadys were moving away, gathering together off to one side. Only 4 of the Surface Council remained. The others were radioactive particles in the air. D-class leadys were already restoring order, gathering up partly destroyed metal figures and bits and removing them. Franks breathed a shuddering sigh. "All right," he said. "You can take us back to the windows. It won't be long now." The leadys separated, and the human group, Moss and Franks and Taylor and the soldiers, walked slowly across the room toward the door. They entered the council chamber. Already a faint touch of gray mitigated the blackness of the windows. "Take us outside," Franks said impatiently. "We'll see it directly. Not in here." A door slid open. A chill blast of cold morning air rushed in, chilling them even through their lead suits. The men glanced at each other uneasily. "Come on," Franks said. "Outside." He walked out through the door, the others following him. They were on a hill overlooking the vast bowl of a valley. Dimly against the graying sky the outline of mountains were forming, becoming tangible. "It'll be bright enough to see in a few minutes," Moss said. He shuddered as a chilling wind caught him and moved around him. "It's worth it, really worth it, to see this again after 8 years, even if it's the last thing we see." "Watch!" Franks snapped. They obeyed, silent and subdued. The sky was clearing, brightening each moment. Someplace far off, echoing across the valley, a rooster crowed. "A chicken," Taylor murmured. "Did you hear?" Behind them the leadys had come out and were standing silently, watching too. The gray sky turned to white and the hills appeared more clearly. Light spread across the valley floor, moving toward them. "God in heaven!" Franks exclaimed. Trees. Trees and forests. A valley of plants and trees, with a few roads winding among them. Farmhouses. A windmill. A barn far down below them. "Look!" Moss whispered. Color came into the sky. The sun was approaching. Birds began to sing. Not far from where they stood, the leaves of a tree danced in the wind. Franks turned to the row of leadys behind them. 8 years we were tricked. There was no war. As soon as we left the surface—"
"Yes," an A-class leady admitted. "As soon as you left, the war ceased. You're right, it was a hoax. You worked hard undersurface, sending up guns and weapons, and we destroyed them as fast as they came up."
"But why?" Taylor asked, dazed. He stared down at the vast valley below. "Why?" "You created us," the leady said, "to pursue the war for you, while you human beings went below the ground in order to survive. But before we could continue the war, it was necessary to analyze it to determine what its purpose was. We did this, and we found that it had no purpose, except perhaps in terms of human needs. Even this was questionable. We investigated further. We found that human cultures pass through phases, each culture in its own time. As the culture ages and begins to lose its objectives, conflict arises within it between those who wish to cast it off and set up a new culture pattern, and those who wish to retain the old with as little change as possible. At this point, a great danger appears. The conflict within threatens to engulf the society in self-war, group against group. The vital traditions may be lost, not merely altered or reformed, but completely destroyed in this period of chaos and anarchy. We have found many such examples in the history of mankind. It is necessary for this hatred within the culture to be directed outward, toward an external group, so that the culture itself may survive its crisis. War is the result. War, to a logical mind, is absurd, but in terms of human needs it plays a vital role, and it will continue to, until man has grown up enough so that no hatred lies within him. Taylor was listening intently. "Do you think this time will come?" "Of course. It has almost arrived now. This is the last war. Man is almost united into one final culture, a world culture. At this point he stands continent against continent, one half of the world against the other half. Only a single step remains, the jump to a unified culture. Man has climbed slowly upward, tending always toward unification of his culture. It will not be long. But it has not come yet, and so the war has to go on, to satisfy the last violent surge of hatred that man felt. 8 years have passed since the war began. In these 8 years we have observed and noted important changes going on in the minds of men.
Fatigue and disinterest, we have seen, are gradually taking the place of hatred and fear. The hatred is being exhausted gradually, over a period of time. But for the present, the hoax must go on, at least for a while longer. You are not ready to learn the truth. You would want to continue the war." "But how did you manage it?" Moss asked. "All the photographs, the samples, the damaged equipment." "Come over here." The leady directed them toward a long, low building. "Work goes on constantly. Whole staffs laboring to maintain a coherent and convincing picture of global war." They entered the building. Leadys were working everywhere, poring over tables and desks. "Examine this project here," the A-class leady said. Two leadys were carefully photographing something, an elaborate model on a tabletop. "It is a good example." The men grouped around, trying to see. It was a model of a ruined city. Taylor studied it in silence for a long time. At last he looked up. "It's San Francisco," he said in a low voice. "This is a model of San Francisco, destroyed. I saw this on the vidscreen piped down to us. The bridges were hit." "Yes, notice the bridges." The leady traced the ruined span with his metal finger. A tiny spider web, almost invisible. "You have no doubt seen photographs of this many times, and of the other tables in this building. San Francisco itself is completely intact. We restored it soon after you left, rebuilding the parts that had been damaged at the start of the war. The work of manufacturing news goes on all the time in this particular building. We are very careful to see that each part fits in with all the other parts. Much time and effort are devoted to it." Franks touched one of the tiny model buildings lying half in ruins. "So this is what you spend your time doing, making model cities and then blasting them?" "No, we do much more. We are caretakers, watching over the whole world. The owners have left for a time, and we must see that the cities are kept clean, that decay is prevented, that everything is kept oiled and in running condition. The gardens, the streets, the water mains, everything must be maintained as it was 8 years ago, so that when the owners return, they will not be displeased. We want to be sure that they will be completely satisfied." Franks tapped Moss on the arm. "Come over here," he said in a low voice. "I want to talk to you." He led Moss and Taylor out of the building, away from the leadys, outside on the hillside. The soldiers followed them. The sun was up and the sky was turning blue. The air smelled sweet and good, the smell of growing things. Taylor removed his helmet and took a deep breath. "I haven't smelled that smell for a long time," he said. "Listen," Frank said, his voice low and hard. "We must get back down at once. There's a lot to get started on. All this can be turned to our advantage." "What do you mean?" Moss asked. "It's a certainty that the Soviets have been tricked, too, the same as us. But we have found out. That gives us an edge over them." "I see," Moss nodded. "We know, but they don't. Their Surface Council has sold out, the same as ours. It works against them the same way. But if we could, with 100 top-level men, we could take over again, restore things as they should be. It would be easy." Moss touched him on the arm. An A-class leady was coming from the building towards them. "We've seen enough," Frank said, raising his voice. "All this is very serious. It must be reported below, and a study made to determine our policy." The leady said nothing. Franks waved to the soldiers. "Let's go." He started toward the warehouse. Most of the soldiers had removed their helmets. Some of them had taken their lead suits off, too, and were relaxing comfortably in their cotton uniforms. They stared around them, down the hillside, at the trees and bushes, the vast expanse of green, the mountains and the sky. "Look at the sun," one of them murmured. "It sure is bright as hell," another said. "We're going back down," Frank said. "Fall in by twos and follow us." Reluctantly, the soldiers regrouped. The leadys watched without emotion as the men marched slowly back toward the warehouse. Franks and Moss and Taylor led them across the ground, glancing alertly at the leadys as they walked. They entered the warehouse. D-class leadys were loading material and weapons on surface carts. Cranes and derricks were working busily everywhere. The work was done with efficiency, but without hurry or excitement. The men stopped, watching. Leadys operating the little carts moved past them, signaling silently to each other. Guns and parts were being hoisted by magnetic cranes and lowered gently into waiting cars. "Come on," Frank said. He turned toward the lip of the tube. A row of D-class leadys was standing in front of it, immobile and silent. Frank stopped, moving back. He looked around. An A-class leady was coming toward him. "Tell them to get out of the way," Frank said. He touched his gun. "You had better move them." Time passed, an endless moment without measure. The men stood nervous and alert, watching the row of leadys in front of them. "As you wish," the A-class leady said. It signaled, and the D-class leadys moved into life. They stepped slowly aside. Moss breathed a sigh of relief. "I'm glad that's over," he said to Franks. "Look at them all. Why don't they try to stop us? They must know what we're going to do." Franks laughed. "Stop us? You saw what happened when they tried to stop us before. They can't. They're only machines. We built them so they can't lay hands on us, and they know that." His voice trailed off. The men stared at the tube entrance. Around them the leadys watched, silent and impassive, their metal faces expressionless. For a long time the men stood without moving. At last Taylor turned away. "Good God!" he said. He was numb, without feeling of any kind. The tube was gone. It was sealed shut, fused over. Only a dull surface of cooling metal greeted them. The tube had been closed. Franks turned his face pale and vacant. The A-class leady shifted. "As you can see, the tube has been shut. We were prepared for this. As soon as all of you were on the surface, the order was given. If you had gone back when we asked you, you would now be safely down below. We had to work quickly because it was such an immense operation." "But why?" Moss demanded angrily. "Because it is unthinkable that you should be allowed to resume the war. With all the tubes sealed, it will be many months before forces from below can reach the surface, let alone organize a military program. By that time the cycle will have entered its last stages. You will not be so perturbed to find your world intact. We had hoped that you would be undersurface when the sealing occurred. Your presence here is a nuisance. When the Soviets broke through, we were able to accomplish their sealing without—" "The Soviets? They broke through?" "Several months ago. They came up unexpectedly to see why the war had not been won. We were forced to act with speed. At this moment they are desperately attempting to cut new tubes to the surface, to resume the war. We have, however, been able to seal each new one as it appears." The leady regarded the three men calmly. "We're cut off," Moss said, trembling. "We can't get back. What'll we do?" "How did you manage to seal the tube so quickly?" Frank asked the leady. "We've been up here only 2 hours." "Bombs are placed just above the first stage of each tube for such emergencies. They are heat bombs. They fuse lead and rock." Gripping the handle of his gun, Franks turned to Moss and Taylor. "What do you say? We can't go back, but we can do a lot of damage, the 15 of us. We have Bender guns. How about it?" He looked around. The soldiers had wandered away again, back toward the exit of the building. They were standing outside, looking at the valley and the sky. A few of them were carefully climbing down the slope. "Would you care to turn over your suits and guns?" the A-class leady asked politely. "The suits are uncomfortable, and you'll have no need for weapons. The Russians have given up theirs, as you can see." Fingers tensed on triggers. 4 men in Russian uniforms were coming toward them from an aircraft that they suddenly realized had landed silently some distance away. "Let them have it!" Franks shouted. "They are unarmed," said the leady. "We brought them here so you could begin peace talks." "We have no authority to speak for our country," Moss said stiffly. "We do not mean diplomatic discussions," the leady explained. "There will be no more. The working out of daily problems of existence will teach you how to get along in the same world. It will not be easy, but it will be done." The Russians halted, and they faced each other with raw hostility. "I am Colonel Borodoy, and I regret giving up our guns," the senior Russian said. "You could have been the first Americans to be killed in almost 8 years." "Or the first Americans to kill," Franks corrected. "No one would know of it except yourselves," the leady pointed out. "It would be useless heroism. Your real concern should be surviving on the surface. We have no food for you, you know." Taylor put his gun in its holster. "They've done a neat job of neutralizing us. Damn them. I propose we move into a city, start raising crops with the help of some leadys, and generally make ourselves comfortable." Drawing his lips tight over his teeth, he glared at the A-class leady. Until our families can come up from undersurface, it's going to be pretty lonesome, but we'll have to manage." "If I may make a suggestion," said another Russian uneasily. "We tried living in a city. It is too empty. It is also too hard to maintain for so few people. We finally settled in the most modern village we could find." "Here, in this country," a third Russian blurted, "we have much to learn from you." The Americans abruptly found themselves laughing. "You probably have a thing or two to teach us yourselves," said Taylor generously, "though I can't imagine what." The Russian colonel grinned. "Would you join us in our village? It would make our work easier and give us company." "Your village?" snapped Franks. "It's American, isn't it? It's ours." The leady stepped between them. "When our plans are completed, the term will be interchangeable. Ours will eventually mean mankind's." It pointed at the aircraft, which was warming up. "The ship is waiting. Will you join each other in making a new home?" The Russians waited while the Americans made up their minds. "I see what the leadys mean about diplomacy becoming outmoded," Franks said at last. "People who work together don't need diplomats. They solve their problems on the operational level instead of at a conference table." The leady led them toward the ship. "It is the goal of history, unifying the world. From family to tribe, to city-state, to nation, to hemisphere. The direction has been toward unification. Now the hemispheres will be joined and—" Taylor stopped listening and glanced back at the location of the tube. Mary was undersurface there. He hated to leave her, even though he couldn't see her again until the tube was unsealed. But then he shrugged and followed the others. If this tiny amalgam of former enemies was a good example, it wouldn't be too long before he and Mary and the rest of humanity would be living on the surface like rational human beings instead of blindly hating moles. "It has taken thousands of generations to achieve," the A-class leady concluded. "Hundreds of centuries of bloodshed and destruction. But each war was a step toward uniting mankind. And now the end is in sight, a world without war. But even that is only the beginning of a new stage of history." "The conquest of space," breathed Colonel Borodoy. "The meaning of life," Moss added. "Eliminating hunger and poverty," said Taylor. The leady opened the door of the ship. "All that and more. How much more, we cannot foresee it any more than the first men who formed a tribe could foresee this day. But it will be unimaginably great." The door closed, and the ship took off toward their new home.
In the Avu Observatory by H. G. Wells. The observatory at Avu in Borneo stands on the spur of the mountain. To the north rises the old crater, black at night against the unfathomable blue of the sky. From the little circular building with its mushroom dome, the slopes plunge steeply downward into the black mysteries of the tropical forest beneath. The little house in which the observer and his assistant live is about 50 yards from the observatory, and beyond this are the huts of their native attendants. Thaddy, the chief observer, was down with a slight fever. His assistant, Woodhouse, paused for a moment in silent contemplation of the tropical night before commencing his solitary vigil. The night was very still. Now and then voices and laughter came from the native huts, or the cry of some strange animal was heard from the midst of the mystery of the forest. Nocturnal insects appeared in ghostly fashion out of the darkness, and fluttered round his light. He thought, perhaps, of all the possibilities of discovery that still lay in the black tangle beneath him. For to the naturalist, the virgin forests of Borneo are still a wonderland full of strange questions and half-suspected discoveries. Woodhouse carried a small lantern in his hand, and its yellow glow contrasted vividly with the infinite series of tints between lavender blue and black in which the landscape was painted. His hands and feet were smeared with ointment against the attacks of the mosquitoes. Even in these days of celestial photography, work done in a purely temporary erection, and with only the most primitive appliances in addition to the telescope, still involves a very large amount of cramped and motionless watch. He sighed as he thought of the physical fatigues before him, stretched himself, and entered the observatory. The reader is probably familiar with the structure of an ordinary astronomical observatory. The building is usually cylindrical in shape, with a very light hemispherical roof capable of being turned round from the interior. The telescope is supported upon a stone pillar in the center, and a clockwork arrangement compensates for the Earth's rotation and allows a star once found to be continuously observed. Besides this, there is a compact tracery of wheels and screws about its point of support, by which the astronomer adjusts it. There is, of course, a slit in the movable roof which follows the eye of the telescope in its survey of the heavens. The observer sits or lies on a sloping wooden arrangement which he can wheel to any part of the observatory as the position of the telescope may require. Within, it is advisable to have things as dark as possible, in order to enhance the brilliance of the stars observed. The lantern flared as Woodhouse entered his circular den, and the general darkness fled into black shadows behind the big machine, from which it presently seemed to creep back over the whole place as the light waned. The slit was a profound transparent blue, in which 6 stars shone with tropical brilliance, and their light lay a pallid gleam along the black tube of the instrument. Woodhouse shifted the roof, and then proceeded to the telescope, turned first one wheel and then another, the great cylinder slowly swinging into a new position. Then he glanced through the finder. The little companion telescope moved the roof a little more, made some further adjustments, and set the clockwork in motion. He took off his jacket, for the night was very hot, and pushed into position the uncomfortable seat to which he was condemned for the next few hours. Then with a sigh he resigned himself to his watch upon the mysteries of space. There was no sound now in the observatory, and the lantern waned steadily. Outside there was the occasional cry of some animal in alarm or pain, or calling to its mate, and the intermittent sounds of the Malay and Dyak servants. Presently one of the men began a queer chanting song, in which the others joined at intervals. After this it would seem that they turned in for the night, for no further sound came from their direction, and the whispering stillness became more and more profound. The clockwork ticked steadily. The shrill hum of a mosquito explored the place, and grew shriller in indignation at Woodhouse's ointment. Then the lantern went out, and all the observatory was black. Woodhouse shifted his position presently, when the slow movement of the telescope had carried it beyond the limits of his comfort. He was watching a little group of stars in the Milky Way, in one of which his chief had seen or fancied a remarkable color variability. It was not a part of the regular work for which the establishment existed, and for that reason, perhaps, Woodhouse was deeply interested. He must have forgotten things terrestrial. All his attention was concentrated upon the great blue circle of the telescope field, a circle powdered, so it seemed, with an innumerable multitude of stars, and all luminous against the blackness of its setting. As he watched, he seemed to himself to become incorporeal, as if he too were floating in the ether of space. Infinitely remote was the faint red spot he was observing. Suddenly the stars were blotted out. A flash of blackness passed, and they were visible again. "Queer," said Woodhouse. "Must have been a bird." The thing happened again, and immediately after the great tube shivered as though it had been struck. Then the dome of the observatory resounded with a series of thundering blows. The stars seemed to sweep aside as the telescope, which had been undampened, swung round and away from its slit in the roof. "Great Scott!" cried Woodhouse. "What's this?" Some huge, vague black shape with a flapping, something like a wing, seemed to be struggling in the aperture of the roof. In another moment the slit was clear again, and the luminous haze of the Milky Way shone warm and bright. The interior of the roof was perfectly black, and only a scraping sound marked the whereabouts of the unknown creature. Woodhouse had scrambled from the seat to his feet. He was trembling violently, and in a perspiration with the suddenness of the occurrence. Was the thing, whatever it was, inside or out? It was big, whatever else it might be. Something shot across the skylight, and the telescope swayed. He started violently and put his arm up. It was in the observatory then, with him. It was clinging to the roof, apparently. What the devil was it? Could it see him? He stood for perhaps a minute in a state of stupefaction. The beast, whatever it was, clawed at the interior of the dome, and then something flapped almost into his face, and he saw the momentary gleam of starlight on a skin like oiled leather. His water bottle was knocked off his little table with a smash. The sense of some strange bird creature hovering a few yards from his face in the darkness was indescribably unpleasant to Woodhouse. As his thought returned, he concluded that it must be some night bird or large bat. At any risk he would see what it was, and pulling a match from his pocket, he tried to strike it on the telescope seat. There was a smoking streak of phosphorescent light. The match flared for a moment, and he saw a vast wing sweeping towards him, a gleam of gray-brown fur, and then he was struck in the face, and the match knocked out of his hand. The blow was aimed at his temple, and a claw tore sideways down his cheek. He reeled and fell. He heard the extinguished lantern smash. Another blow followed as he fell. He was partly stunned. He felt his own warm blood stream out upon his face. Instinctively he felt his eyes had been struck out, and turning over on his face to protect them, tried to crawl under the protection of the telescope. He was struck again upon the back, and he heard his jacket rip, and then the thing hit the roof of the observatory. He edged as far back as he could between the wooden seat and the eyepiece of the instrument, and turned his body round so that it was chiefly his feet that were exposed. With these he could at least kick. He was still in a mystified state. The strange beast banged about in the darkness, and presently clung to the telescope, making it sway and the gear rattle. Once it flapped near him, and he kicked out madly and felt a soft body with his feet. He was horribly scared now. It must be a big thing to swing the telescope like that. He saw for a moment the outline of a head black against the starlight, with sharply pointed upstanding ears, and a crest between them. It seemed to him to be as big as a mastiff's. Then he began to bawl out as loudly as he could for help. At that the thing came down upon him again. As it did so, his hand touched something beside him on the floor. He kicked out, and the next moment his ankle was gripped and held by a row of keen teeth. He yelled again and tried to free his leg by kicking with the other. Then he realized he had the broken water bottle at his hand, and snatching it, he struggled into a sitting posture, and feeling in the darkness towards his foot, gripped a velvety ear, like the ear of a big cat. He had seized the water bottle by its neck, and brought it down with a shivering crash upon the head of the strange beast. He repeated the blow, and then stabbed and jabbed with the jagged end of it, in the darkness, where he judged the face might be. The small teeth relaxed their hold, and at once Woodhouse pulled his leg free and kicked hard. He felt the sickening feel of fur and bone giving under his foot. There was a tearing bite at his arm, and he struck over it at the face, as he judged, and hit damp fur. There was a pause. Then he heard the sound of claws and the dragging of a heavy body away from him over the observatory floor. Then there was silence, broken only by his own sobbing breath, and a sound like licking. Everything was black except for the parallelogram of the blue skylight with the luminous dust of stars, against which the end of the telescope now appeared in silhouette. He waited, as it seemed, an interminable time. Was the thing coming on again? He felt in his trouser pocket for some matches, and found one remaining. He tried to strike this, but the floor was wet, and it spat and went out. He cursed. He could not see where the door was situated. In his struggle, he had quite lost his bearings. The strange beast, disturbed by the splutter of the match, began to move again. "Time!" called Woodhouse, with a sudden gleam of mirth, but the thing was not coming at him again. He must have heard it, he thought, with the broken bottle. He felt a dull pain in his ankle. Probably he was bleeding there. He wondered if it would support him if he tried to stand up. The night outside was very still. There was no sound of anyone moving. The sleepy fools had not heard those wings battering upon the dome, nor his shouts. It was no good wasting strength in shouting. The monster flapped its wings and startled him into a defensive attitude. He hit his elbow against the seat, and it fell over with a crash. He cursed this, and then he cursed the darkness. Suddenly the oblong patch of starlight seemed to sway to and fro. Was he going to faint? It would never do to faint. He clutched his fists and set his teeth to hold himself together. Where had the door got to? It occurred to him he could get his bearings by the stars visible through the skylight. The patch of stars he saw was in Sagittarius and southeastward. The door was north, or was it north by west? He tried to think. If he could get the door open, he might retreat. It might be the thing was wounded. The suspense was beastly. "Look here," he said. "If you don't come on, I shall come at you." Then the thing began clambering up the side of the observatory, and he saw its black outline gradually blot out the skylight. Was it in retreat? He forgot about the door, and watched as the dome shifted and creaked. Somehow he did not feel very frightened or excited now. He felt a curious sinking sensation inside him. The sharply defined patch of light, with the black form moving across it, seemed to be growing smaller and smaller. That was curious. He began to feel very thirsty, and yet he did not feel inclined to get anything to drink. He seemed to be sliding down a long funnel. He felt a burning sensation in his throat, and then he perceived it was broad daylight, and that one of the Dyak servants was looking at him with a curious expression. Then there was the top of Thaddeus' face, upside down. Funny fellow, Thaddy, to go about like that. Then he grasped the situation better, and perceived that his head was on Thaddeus' knee, and Thaddy was giving him brandy. And then he saw the eyepiece of the telescope with a lot of red smears on it. He began to remember. "You've made this observatory into a pretty mess," said Thaddy. The Dyak boy was beating up an egg in brandy. Woodhouse took this and sat up. He felt a sharp twinge of pain. His ankle was tied up. So were his arm and the side of his face. The smashed glass, red-stained, lay about the floor. The telescope seat was overturned, and by the opposite wall was a dark pool. The door was open, and he saw the gray summit of the mountain against the brilliant background of the blue sky. "Pah!" said Woodhouse. "Who's been killing calves here? Take me out of it." Then he remembered the thing, and the fight he had had with it. "What was it?" he said to Thaddy. "The thing I fought with." "You know that best," said Thaddy. "But anyhow, don't worry yourself now about it. Have some more to drink." Thaddy, however, was curious enough, and it was a hard struggle between duty and inclination to keep Woodhouse quiet until he was decently put away in bed, and had slept upon the copious dose of meat extract Thaddy considered advisable. They then talked it over together. "It was," said Woodhouse, "more like a big bat than anything else in the world. It had sharp, short ears and soft fur, and its wings were leathery. Its teeth were little but devilish sharp, and its jaw could not have been very strong, or else it would have bitten through my ankle." "It was pretty nearly," said Thaddy. "It seemed to me to hit out with its claws pretty freely. That is about as much as I know about the beast. Our conversation was intimate, so to speak, and yet not confidential. The Dyak chaps talk about a big Kalugo, a clang-oo-tang, whatever that might be. It does not often attack man, but I suppose you made it nervous. They say there is a big Kalugo and a little Kalugo, and there's something else that sounds like gobble. They all fly about at night. For my own part, I know there are flying foxes and flying lemurs about here, but they are none of them very big beasts. There are more things in heaven and earth, said Woodhouse, and Thaddy groaned at the quotation, and more particularly in the forests of Borneo than are dreamt of in our philosophies. On the whole, if the Borneo fauna is going to disgorge any more of its novelties upon me, I should prefer that it did so when I was not occupied in the observatory at night and alone.
Postmark Ganymede by Robert Silverberg. Consider the poor mailman of the future. To sleet and snow and dead of night, things that must not keep him from his appointed rounds will be added, sub-zero void, meteors, and planets that won't stay put. Maybe he'll decide that for 6 cents an ounce it just ain't worth it. "I'm washed up," Preston growled bitterly. "They made a postman out of me. A postman!" He crumpled the assignment memo into a small hard ball and hurled it at the bristly image of himself in the bar mirror. He hadn't shaved in 3 days, which was how long it had been since he had been notified of his removal from Space Patrol service and his transfer to postal delivery. Suddenly Preston felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up and saw a man in the trim grey of a patrolman's uniform. "What do you want, Dawes?" "Chief's been looking for you, Preston. It's time for you to get going on your run." Preston scowled. "Time to go deliver the mail, eh?" He spat. "Don't they have anything better to do with good spacemen than to make letter-carriers out of them?" The other man shook his head. "You won't get anywhere grousing about it, Preston. Your papers don't specify which branch you're assigned to, and if they want to make you carry the mail, that's it." His voice became suddenly gentle. "Come on, Pres. One last drink and then let's go. You don't want to spoil a good record, do you?" "No," Preston said reflectively. He gulped his drink and stood up. "OK, I'm ready. Neither snow nor rain shall stay me from my appointed rounds, or however the damn thing goes." "That's a smart attitude, Preston. Come on, I'll walk you over to administration." Savagely, Preston ripped away the hand that the other had put around his shoulders. "I can get there myself. At least give me credit for that." "OK," Dawes said, shrugging. "Well, good luck, Preston." "Yeah, thanks. Thanks real lots." He pushed his way past the man in space greys and shouldered past a couple of barflies as he left. He pushed open the door of the bar and stood outside for a moment. It was near midnight and the sky over Nome Spaceport was bright with stars. Preston's trained eye picked out Mars, Jupiter, Uranus. There they were, waiting. But he would spend the rest of his days ferrying letters on the Ganymede run. He sucked in the cold night air of summertime Alaska and squared his shoulders. 2 hours later, Preston sat at the controls of a one-man patrol ship, just as he had in the old days. Only the control panel was bare where the firing studs for the heavy guns was found in regular patrol ships, and in the cargo hold, instead of crates of spare ammo, there were 3 bulging sacks of mail destined for the colony on Ganymede. Slight difference, Preston thought, as he set up his blasting pattern. "OK, Preston," came the voice from the tower. "You've got clearance." "Cheers," Preston said, and yanked the blast lever. The ship jolted upward, and for a second he felt a little of the old thrill. Until he remembered. He took the ship out in space, saw the blackness in the viewplate. The radio crackled. "Come in, postal ship. Come in, postal ship." "I'm in. What do you want?" "We're your convoy," a hard voice said. "Patrol ship 08756, Lieutenant Mellors above you. Down at 3 o'clock, patrol ship 10732, Lieutenant Gunderson. We'll take you through the pirate belt." Preston felt his face go hot with shame. Mellors, Gunderson. They would stick 2 of his old sidekicks on the job of guarding him. "Please acknowledge," Mellors said. Preston paused, then... Postal Ship 1872, Lieutenant Preston aboard. I acknowledge message." There was a stunned silence. "Preston? Hal Preston?" "The one and only," Preston said. "What are you doing on a postal ship?" Mellors asked. "Why don't you ask the Chief that? He's the one who yanked me out of the Patrol and put me here." "Can you beat that?" Gunderson asked incredulously. "Hal Preston on a postal ship?" "Yeah, incredible, isn't it?" Preston asked bitterly. "You can't believe your ears. Well, you better believe it, because here I am." "Must be some clerical error," Gunderson said. "Let's change the subject," Preston snapped. They were silent for a few moments as the three ships, two armed, one loaded with mail for Ganymede, streaked away from Earth. Manipulating his controls with the ease of long experience, Preston guided the ship smoothly toward the gleaming bulk of far-off Jupiter. Even at this distance he could see 5 or 6 bright pips surrounding the huge planet. There was Callisto, and there was Ganymede. He made computations, checked his controls, figured orbits. Anything to keep from having to talk to his 2 ex-patrol mates, or from having to think about the humiliating job he was on. Anything to... "Pirates moving up at 2 o'clock." Preston came awake. He picked off the location of the pirate ships. There were 2 of them coming up out of the asteroid belt. Small, deadly, compact, they orbited towards him. He pounded the instrument panel in impotent rage, looking for the guns that weren't there. "Don't worry, Pres," came Mellors' voice. "We'll take care of them for you." "Thanks," Preston said bitterly. He watched as the pirate ships approached, longing to trade places with the men in the patrol ships above and below him. Suddenly a bright spear of flame lashed out across space, and the hull of Gunderson's ship glowed cherry red. "I'm okay," Gunderson reported immediately. "Screens took the charge." Preston gripped his controls and threw the ship into a plunging dive that dropped it back behind the protection of both patrol ships. He saw Gunderson and Mellors converge on one of the pirates. 2 blue beams licked out, and the pirate ship exploded. But then the second pirate swooped down in an unexpected dive. "Look out!" Preston yelled helplessly, but it was too late. Beams ripped into the hull of Mellors' ship, and a dark fissure line opened down the side of the ship. Preston smashed his hand against the control panel. Better to die in an honest dogfight than to live this way. It was 1 against 1 now. Gunderson against the pirate. Preston dropped back again to take advantage of the patrol ship's protection. "I'm going to try a diversionary tactic," Gunderson said on untappable tight beam. "Get ready to cut under and streak for Ganymede with all you've got." "Check." Preston watched as the tactic got under way. Gunderson's ship travelled in a long, looping spiral that drew the pirate into the upper quadrant of space. His path free, Preston guided his ship under the other 2 and towards unobstructed freedom. As he looked back, he saw Gunderson steaming for the pirate on a shore collision orbit. He turned away. The score was 2 patrolmen dead, 2 ships wrecked, but the mails would get through. Shaking his head, Preston leaned forward over his control board and headed on toward Ganymede. The blue-white frozen moon hung beneath him. Preston snapped on the radio. "Ganymede colony, come in, please. This is your postal ship." The words tasted sour in his mouth. There was silence for a second. "Come in, Ganymede," Preston repeated impatiently, and then the sound of a distress signal cut across his audio pickup. It was coming on wide beam from the satellite below, and they had cut out all receiving facilities in an attempt to step up their transmitter. Preston reached for the wide beam stud, pressed it. "Okay, I pick up your signal, Ganymede. Come in now." "This is Ganymede," a tense voice said. "We've got trouble down here. Who are you?" "Mail ship," Preston said. "From Earth. What's going on?" There was the sound of voices whispering somewhere near the microphone. Finally, "Hello, mail ship?" "Yep." "You're going to have to turn back to Earth, fellow. You can't land here. It's rough on us, missing a mail trip, but..." Preston said impatiently, "Why can't I land? What the devil's going on down there?" "We've been invaded," the tired voice said. "The colony's been completely surrounded by iceworms." "Iceworms?" "The local native life," the colonist explained. "They're about 30 feet long, a foot wide, and mostly mouth. There's a ring of them about 100 yards wide surrounding the dome. They can't get in, and we can't get out. And we can't figure out any possible approach for you." "Pretty," Preston said. "But why didn't the things bother you while you were building the dome?" "Apparently they have a very long hibernation cycle. We've only been here 2 years, you know. The iceworms must all have been asleep when we came, but they came swarming out of the ice by the hundreds last month." "How come Earth doesn't know?" "The antenna for our long-range transmitter was outside the dome. One of the worms came by and chewed the antenna right off. All we've got left is this short-range thing we're using, and it's no good more than 10,000 miles from here. You're the first one who's been this close since it happened." "I get it." Preston closed his eyes for a second, trying to think things out. The colony was under blockade by hostile alien life, therefore making it impossible for him to deliver the mail. OK. If he'd been a regular member of the Postal Service, he'd have given it up as a bad job and gone back to Earth to report the difficulty. "But I'm not going back. I'll be the best damned mailman they've got." "Give me a landing orbit anyway, Ganymede." "But you can't come down. How will you leave your ship?" "Don't worry about that," Preston said calmly. "We have to worry. We don't dare open the dome with those creatures outside. You can't come down, Postal Ship." "You want your mail, or don't you?" The colonist paused. "Well—" "OK then," Preston said. "Shut up and give me landing coordinates." There was a pause, and then the figures started coming over. Preston jotted them down on a scratch pad. "OK, I've got them. Now sit tight and wait." He glanced contemptuously at the 3 mail pouches behind him, grinned, and started setting up the orbit. "Mailman, am I? I'll show them." He brought the postal ship down with all the skill of his years in the Patrol, spiralling in around the big satellite of Jupiter as cautiously and as precisely as if he were zeroing in on a pirate lair in the asteroid belt. In its own way, this was as dangerous, perhaps even more so. Preston guided the ship into an ever-narrowing orbit, which he stabilized about 100 miles over the surface of Ganymede. As his ship swung around the moon's poles in its tight orbit, he began to figure some fuel computations. His scratch pad began to fill with notations. Fuel storage, escape velocity, margin of error, safety factor. Finally he looked up. He had computed exactly how much spare fuel he had, how much he could afford to waste. It was a small figure, too small perhaps. He turned on the radio. "Ganymede?" "Where are you, Postal Ship?" "I'm in a tight orbit about 100 miles up," Preston said. "Give me the figures on the circumference of your dome, Ganymede." 7 miles, the colonist said. "What are you planning to do?" Preston didn't answer. He broke contact and scribbled some more figures. 7 miles of iceworms, eh? That was too much to handle. He'd planned on dropping flaming fuel on them and burning them out, but he couldn't do it that way. He'd have to try a different tactic. Down below he could see the blue-white ammonia ice that was the frozen atmosphere of Ganymede. Shimmering gently amid the whiteness was the transparent yellow of the dome, beneath whose curved walls lived the Ganymede colony. Even forewarned, Preston shuddered. Surrounding the dome was a living, writhing belt of giant worms. "Lovely," he said. "Just lovely." Getting up, he clambered over the mail sacks and headed toward the rear of the ship, hunting for the auxiliary fuel tanks. Working rapidly, he lugged one out and strapped it into an empty gun turret, making sure he could get it loose again when he'd need it. He wiped away sweat and checked the angle at which the fuel tank would face the ground when he came down for a landing. Satisfied, he knocked a hole in the side of the fuel tank. "OK, Ganymede," he radioed. "I'm coming down." He blasted loose from the tight orbit and rocked the ship down on manual. The forbidding surface of Ganymede grew closer and closer. Now he could see the iceworms plainly. Hideous, thick creatures, lying coiled in masses around the dome. Preston checked his spacesuit, making sure it was sealed. The instruments told him he was a bare 10 miles above Ganymede now. One more swing around the poles should do it. He peered out as the dome came below, and once again snapped on the radio. "I'm going to come down and burn a path through those worms of yours. Watch me carefully, and jump to it when you see me land. I want that airlock open, or else. But no buts." He was right overhead now. Just one ordinary type gun would solve the whole problem, he thought, but postal ships didn't have guns. They weren't supposed to need them. He centered the ship as well as he could on the dome below, and threw it into automatic pilot. Jumping from the control panel, he ran back toward the gun turret and slammed shut the plexi-light screen. Its outer wall opened, and the fuel tank went tumbling outward and down. He returned to his control panel seat and looked at the view screen. He smiled. The fuel tank was lying near the dome, right in the middle of the nest of iceworms. The fuel was leaking from the puncture. The iceworms writhed in from all sides. "Now," Preston said grimly. The ship roared down, jets blasting. The fire licked out, heated the ground, melted snow, ignited the fuel tank. A gigantic flame blazed up, reflected harshly off the snows of Ganymede. And the mindless iceworms came, marching toward the fire, being consumed as still others devoured the bodies of the dead and dying. Preston looked away and concentrated on the business of finding a place to land the ship. The Holocaust still raged as he leapt down from the catwalk of the ship, clutching one of the heavy mail sacks, and struggled through the melting snows to the airlock. He grinned. The airlock was open. Arms grabbed him, pulled him through. Someone opened his helmet. "Great job, postman." "There are 2 more mail sacks," Preston said. "Get men out after them." The man in charge gestured to 2 young colonists who donned spacesuits and dashed through the airlock. Preston watched as they raced to the ship, climbed in, and returned a few moments later with the mail sacks. "You've got it all," Preston said. "I'm checking out. I'll get word to the patrol to get here and clean up that mess for you." "How can we thank you?" the official-looking man asked. "No need to," Preston said casually. "I had to get that mail down here some way, didn't I?" He turned away, smiling to himself. Maybe the chief had known what he was doing when he took an experienced patrolman and dumped him into postal. Delivering the mail to Ganymede had been more hazardous than fighting off 6 space pirates. "I guess I was wrong," Preston thought. "This is no snap job for old men." Preoccupied, he started out through the airlock. The man in charge caught his arm. "Say, we don't even know your name. Here you're a hero and—" "Hero?" Preston shrugged. "All I did was deliver the mail. It's all in a day's work, you know. The mail's got to get through."
Toy Shop by Harry Harrison. Because there were few adults in the crowd, and Colonel Biff Houghton stood over 6 feet tall, he could see every detail of the demonstration. The children, and most of the parents, gaped in wide-eyed wonder. Biff Houghton was too sophisticated to be awed. He stayed on because he wanted to find out what the trick was that made the gadget work. "It's all explained right here in your instruction book," the demonstrator said, holding up a garishly printed booklet, opened to a 4-color diagram. "You all know how magnets pick things up, and I bet you even know that the Earth itself is one great big magnet. That's why compasses always point north. Well, the Atomic Wonder Space Wave Tapper hangs onto those space waves. Invisibly all about us, and even going right through us, are the magnetic waves of the Earth. The Atomic Wonder rides those waves just the way a ship rides the waves in the ocean. Now watch." Every eye was on him as he put the gaudy model rocket ship on top of the table and stepped back. It was made of stamped metal and seemed as incapable of flying as a can of ham, which it very much resembled. Neither wings, propellers, nor jets broke through the painted surface. It rested on 3 rubber wheels, and coming out through the bottom was a double strand of thin insulated wire. This white wire ran across the top of the black table and terminated in a control box in the demonstrator's hand. An indicator light, a switch, and a knob appeared to be the only controls. "I turn on the power switch, sending a surge of current to the wave receptors," he said.
The switch clicked and the light blinked on and off with a steady pulse. Then the man began to slowly turn the knob. A careful touch on the wave generator is necessary, as we are dealing with the powers of the whole world here. A concerted "ah" swept through the crowd as the space wave tapper shivered a bit, then rose slowly into the air. The demonstrator stepped back, and the toy rose higher and higher, bobbing gently on the invisible waves of magnetic force that supported it. Ever so slowly the powers reduced, and it settled back to the table. "Only $17.95, the young man said, putting a large price sign on the table, "for the complete set of the Atomic Wonder, the Space Tapper control box, battery, and instruction book." At the appearance of the price card, the crowd broke up noisily, and the children rushed away towards the operating model trains. The demonstrator's words were lost in their noisy passage, and after a moment he sank into a gloomy silence. He put the control box down, yawned, and sat on the edge of the table. Colonel Horton was the only one left after the crowd had moved on. "Could you tell me how this thing works?" the colonel asked, coming forward. The demonstrator brightened up and picked up one of the toys. "Well, if you look here, sir," he opened the hinge top, "you will see the space wave coils at each end of the chip." With a pencil he pointed out the odd-shaped plastic forms about an inch in diameter that had been wound, apparently at random, with a few turns of copper wire. Except for these coils, the interior of the model was empty. The coils were wired together, and other wires ran through the hole in the bottom of the control box. Biff Horton turned a very quizzical eye on the gadget, and upon the demonstrator, who completely ignored this sign of disbelief. "Inside the control box is the battery," the young man said, snapping it open and pointing to an ordinary flashlight battery. "The current goes through the power switch and power light to the wave generator." "What you mean to say," Biff broke in, "is that the juice from this 15-cent battery goes through this cheap rheostat to those meaningless coils in the model, and absolutely nothing happens. Now, tell me what really flies the thing. If I'm going to drop $18 for 6 bits worth of tin, I want to know what I'm getting." The demonstrator flushed. "I'm sorry, sir," he stammered. "I wasn't trying to hide anything. Like any magic trick, this one can't really be demonstrated until it has been purchased." He leaned forward and whispered confidentially, "I'll tell you what I'll do, though. This thing is way overpriced and hasn't been moving at all. The manager said I could let them go at $3 if I could find any takers. If you want to buy it for that price—" "Sold, my boy," the colonel said, slamming 3 bills down on the table. "I'll give that much for it, no matter how it works. The boys in the shop will get a kick out of it." He tapped the winged rocket on his chest. "Now, really, what holds it up?" The demonstrator looked around carefully, then pointed. "Strings," he said. "Or rather, a black thread. It runs from the top of the model, through a tiny loop in the ceiling, and back down to my hand, tied to this ring on my finger. When I back up, the model rises. It's as simple as that." "All good illusions are simple," the colonel grunted, tracing the black thread with his eye. "As long as there is plenty of flim-flam to distract the viewer." "If you don't have a black table, a black cloth will do," the young man said. "And the arch of a doorway is a good sight. Just see that the room in back is dark." "Wrap it up, my boy. I wasn't born yesterday. I'm an old hand at this kind of thing." Biff Horton sprang it at the next Thursday night poker party. The gang were all missile men, and they cheered and jeered as he hammed up the introduction. "Let me copy the diagram, Biff. I could use some of those magnetic waves in the new bird. Those flashlight batteries are cheaper than locks. This is the thing of the future." Only Teddy Kaner caught wise as the flight began. He was an amateur magician and spotted the gimmick at once. He kept silent with professional courtesy, and smiled ironically as the rest of the bunch grew silent, one by one. The colonel was a good showman, and he had set the scene well. He almost had them believing in the space wave tapper before he was through. When the model had landed and he had switched it off, he couldn't stop them from crowding around the table. "A thread!" one of the engineers shouted almost with relief, and they all laughed along with him. Too bad, the head project physicist said. I was hoping that the little space wave tapping could help us out. Let me try a flight with it. Teddy Kaner first, Biff announced. He spotted it while you were all watching the flashing lights. Only he didn't say anything. Kaner slipped the ring with the black thread over his finger and started to step back. You have to turn the switch on first, Biff said. I know, Kaner smiled, but that's part of the illusion, the spiel and the misdirection. I'm going to try this coal first so I can get it moving up and down smoothly, then go through it with the whole works. He moved his hand back smoothly in a professional manner that drew no attention to it. The model lifted from the table, then crashed back down. The thread broke, Kaner said. You jerked it instead of pulling smoothly, Biff said, and knotted the broken thread. Here, let me show you how to do it. The thread broke again when Biff tried it, which got a good laugh that made his collar a little warm. Someone mentioned the poker game. This was the only time that poker was mentioned or even remembered that night, because very soon after this they found that the thread would lift the model only when the switch was on, and 2.5 volts throwing through the joke coils. With the current turned off, the model was too heavy to lift. The thread broke every time. I still think it's a screwy idea, the young man said. 1 week getting fallen arches, demonstrating those toy ships for every brat within 1,000 miles, then selling the thing for $3 when they must have cost at least $100 apiece to make. But you did sell the 10 of them to people who would be interested? The older man asked. I think so. I caught a few Air Force officers and a colonel in missiles one day. Then there was one official I remembered from the Bureau of Standards. Luckily he didn't recognize me. Then those 2 professors you spotted from the university. Then the problem is out of our hands and into theirs. All we have to do now is sit back and wait for results. What results? These people weren't interested when we were hammering on their doors with the proof. We've patented the coils and can prove to anyone that there is a reduction in weight around them when they are operating. But a small reduction, and we don't know what's causing it. No one can be interested in a thing like that. A fractional weight decrease in a clumsy model, certainly not enough to lift the weight of the generator. No one wrapped up in massive fuel consumption, tons of lift and such, is going to have time to worry about a crackpot who thinks he has found a minor slip in Newton's laws. You think they will now? The young man asked, cracking his knuckles impatiently. I know they will. The tensile strength of that thread is correctly adjusted to the weight of the model. The thread will break if you try to lift the model with it. Yet you can lift the model after a small increment of its weight has been removed by the coils. This is going to bug those men. Nobody is going to ask them to solve the problem or concern themselves with it, but it will nag at them because they know that this effect can't possibly exist. They'll see at once that the magnetic wave theory is nonsense. Or perhaps true. We don't know. But they will all be thinking about it and worrying about it. Someone is going to experiment in his basement, just as a hobby of course, to find the cause of the error. And he, or someone else, is going to find out what makes those coils work. Or maybe a way to improve them. And we have the patents. Correct. They will be doing the research that will take them out of the massive lift propulsion business and into the field of pure space flight. And in doing so they will be making us rich, whenever the time comes to manufacture, the young man said cynically. We'll all be rich, son, the older man said, patting him on the shoulder. Believe me, you're not going to recognize this old world 10 years from now.
The Vortex Blaster by E. E. Doc Smith. Introducing Storm Cloud, who through tragedy is destined to become the most noted figure in the galaxy, the Vortex Blaster. Safety devices that do not protect. The unsinkable ships that, before the days of Bergenholm and of atomic and cosmic energy, sank into the waters of Earth. More particularly, safety devices which, while protecting against one agent of destruction, attract magnet-like another and worse. Such as the armored cable within the walls of a wooden house. It protects the electrical conductors within against accidental external shorts, but inadequately grounded as it must of necessity be, it may attract, and upon occasion has attracted, the stupendous force of lightning. Then fused, volatilized, flaming incandescent through the length, breadth, and height of a dwelling, that dwelling's existence thereafter is to be measured in minutes. Specifically, 4 lightning rods. The lightning rods protecting the chromium, glass, and plastic home of Neil Cloud. Those rods were adequately grounded with copper-silver cables the bigness of a strong man's arm. For Neil Cloud, atomic physicist, knew his lightning, and he was taking no chances whatever with the safety of his lovely wife and their 3 wonderful kids. He did not know, he did not even suspect, that under certain conditions of atmospheric potential and of ground magnetic stress his perfectly designed lightning rod system would become a super-powerful magnet for flying vortices of atomic disintegration. And now Neil Cloud, atomic physicist, sat at his desk in a strained, dull apathy. His face was a yellowish gray-white, his tendoned hands gripped rigidly the arms of his chair. His eyes, hard and lifeless, stared unseeingly past the small 3-dimensional block portrait of all that had made life worth living. For his guardian against lightning had been a vortex magnet at the moment when a luckless wight had attempted to abate the nuisance of a loose atomic vortex. That wight died, of course, they almost always do, and the vortex, instead of being destroyed, was simply broken up into an indefinite number of widely scattered new vortices. And one of these bits of furious, uncontrolled energy, resembling more nearly a handful of material rived from a sun than anything else with which ordinary man is familiar, darted toward and crashed downward to earth through Neil Cloud's new house. That home did not burn. It simply exploded. Nothing of it, in it, or around it stood a chance, for in a fractional second of time the place where it had been was a crater of seething, boiling lava. A crater which filled the atmosphere to a height of miles with poisonous vapors, which flooded all circumambient space with lethal radiations. Cosmically, the whole thing was infinitesimal. Ever since man learned how to liberate intra-atomic energy, the vortices of disintegration had been breaking out of control. Such accidents had been happening, were happening, and would continue indefinitely to happen. More than one world, perhaps, had been or would be consumed to the last gram by such loose atomic vortices. What of that? Of what real importance are a few grains of sand to an ocean beach 5,000 miles long, 100 miles wide, and 10 miles deep? And even to that individual grain of sand called Earth, or, in modern parlance, Sol 3, or Tellus of Sol, or simply Tellus, the affair was of negligible importance. One man had died, but in dying he had added one more page to the thick bulk of negative results already on file. That Mrs. Cloud and her children had perished was merely unfortunate. The vortex itself was not yet a real threat to Tellus. It was a new one, and thus it would be a long time before it would become other than a local menace. And well before that could happen, before even the oldest of Tellus's loose vortices had eaten away much of her mass or poisoned much of her atmosphere, her scientists would have solved the problem. It was unthinkable that Tellus, the point of origin and the very center of galactic civilization, should cease to exist. But to Neil Cloud the accident was the ultimate catastrophe. His personal universe had crashed in ruins. What was left was not worth picking up. He and Jo had been married for almost 20 years, and the bonds between them had grown stronger, deeper, truer, with every passing day. And the kids. It couldn't have happened. Fate couldn't do this to him. But it had. It could. Gone. 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 And to Neil Cloud, atomic physicist, sitting there at his desk in torn, despairing abstraction, with black maggots of thought gnawing holes in his brain, the catastrophe was doubly galling because of its cruel irony. For he was second from the top in the Atomic Research Laboratory. His life's work had been a search for a means of extinguishment of exactly such loose vortices as had destroyed his all. His eyes focused vaguely upon the portrait. Clear, honest gray eyes, lines of character and of humor, sweetly curved lips, ready to smile or to kiss. He wrenched his eyes away and scribbled briefly upon a sheet of paper. Then, getting up stiffly, he took the portrait and moved woodenly across the room to a furnace. As though enshrining it, he placed the plastic block upon a refractory between the electrodes and threw a switch. After the flaming arc had done its work, he turned and handed the paper to a tall man dressed in plain gray leather who had been watching him with quiet, understanding eyes. Significant enough to the initiated of the importance of this laboratory is the fact that it was headed by an unattached lensman. "As of now, Phil, if it's QX with you." The gray lensman took the document, glanced at it, and slowly, meticulously tore it into 16 equal pieces. Storm," he denied gently. "Not a resignation. Leave of absence, yes. Indefinite, but not a resignation." "Why?" It was scarcely a question. Cloud's voice was level, uninflected. "I won't be worth the paper I'd waste." "Now, no," the lensman conceded, "but the future's another matter. I haven't said anything so far because to anyone who knew you and Joe as I knew you, it was abundantly clear that nothing could be said." Two hands gripped and held. "For the future, though, 4 words were uttered long ago that have never been improved upon. This too shall pass." "You think so?" "I don't think so, Storm. I know so. I've been around a long time. You are too good a man, and the world has too much use for you to go down permanently out of control. You've got a place in the world, and you'll be back." A thought struck the lensman, and he went on in an altered tone. "You wouldn't, but of course you wouldn't. You couldn't." "I don't think so. No, I won't. That never was any kind of a solution to any problem." Nor was it. Until that moment suicide had not entered Cloud's mind, and he rejected it instantly. His kind of man did not take the easy way out. After a brief farewell, Cloud made his way to an elevator and was whisked down to the garage, into his big blue D. Kodinsky 16 Special, and away. Through traffic so heavy that front, rear, and side bumpers almost touched, he drove with his wonted cool skill, even though consciously he did not know that the other cars were there. He slowed, turned, stopped, gave her the oof, all in correct response to flashing signals in all shapes and colors, purely automatically. Consciously he did not know where he was going, nor care. If he thought at all, his numbed brain was simply trying to run away from its own bitter imaging, which, if he had thought at all, he would have known to be a hopeless task. But he did not think. He simply acted, dumbly, miserably. His eyes saw optically, his body reacted mechanically. His thinking brain was completely in abeyance. Into a one-way skyway he rocketed, along it over the suburbs and into the transcontinental superhighway. Edging inward, lane after lane, he reached the unlimited way. Unlimited, that is, except for being limited to cars of not less than 700 horsepower in perfect mechanical condition, driven by registered, tested drivers at speeds not less than 125 miles an hour, flashed his registry number at the control station, and shoved his right foot down to the floor. Now everyone knows that an ordinary D. Kodinsky Sporter will do 140 honestly measured miles in 1 honestly measured hour. But very few ordinary drivers have ever found out how fast one of those brutal, big, souped-up 16s can wheel. They simply haven't got what it takes to open one up. Storm Cloud found out that day. He held that 2.5-ton juggernaut on the road wide open for 2 solid hours, but it didn't help. Drive as he would, he could not outrun that which rode with him, beside him, and within him, and behind him. For Joe was there. Joe and the kids, but mostly Joe. It was Joe's car as much as it was his. Babe, the big blue ox, was Joe's pet name for it, because, like Paul Bunyan's fabulous beast, it was pretty nearly 6 feet between the eyes. Everything they had ever had was that way. She was in the seat beside him. Every dear, every sweet, every luscious, lovely memory of her was there, and behind him, just out of the eye-corner visibility, were the 3 kids. And a whole lifetime of this loomed ahead, a vista of emptiness more vacuous far than the emptiest reaches of intergalactic space. Damnation! He couldn't stand much more of... High over the roadway far ahead, a brilliant octagon flared red. That meant stop in any language. Cloud eased up his accelerator, eased down his mighty brakes. He pulled up at the control station, and a trimly uniformed officer made a gesture. "Sorry, sir," the policeman said,
But you'll have to detour here. There's a loose atomic vortex beside the road up ahead." "Oh, it's Dr. Cloud." Recognition flashed into the guard's eyes. "I didn't recognize you at first. You can go ahead, of course. It'll be 2 or 3 miles before you have to put on your armor. You'll know when better than anyone can tell you. They didn't tell us they were going to send for you. It's just a little new one, and the dope we got was that they were going to shove it off into the canyon with pressure." "They didn't send for me." Cloud tried to smile. "I'm just driving around. Haven't my armor along even, so I guess I might as well go back." He turned the special around. A loose vortex, new. There might be 100 of them, scattered over a radius of 200 miles. Sisters of the one that had murdered his family. The hellish spawn of that accursed number 11 vortex that damnably incompetent, bungling ass had tried to blow up. Into his mind there leapt a picture, wire sharp, of number 11 as he had last seen it, and simultaneously an idea hit him like a blow from a fist. He thought. Really thought. Now, cogently, intensely, clearly. If he could do it, could actually blow out the atomic flame of an atomic vortex, not exactly revenge, but by Clonzo's brazen bowels it would work. It'd have to work. He'd make it work. And grimly, quietly, but alive in every fiber now, he drove back toward the city, practically as fast as he had come away. If the lensman was surprised at Cloud's sudden reappearance in the laboratory, he did not show it. Nor did he offer any comment as his erstwhile first assistant went to various lockers and cupboards assembling meters, coils, tubes, armor, and other paraphernalia and apparatus. "Guess that's all I'll need, Chief," Cloud remarked finally. "Here's a blank check. If some of this stuff should happen to be in usable condition when I get done with it, fill it out to suit, will you?" "No." And the lensman tore up the check just as he had torn up the resignation. "If you want the stuff for legitimate purposes, you're on patrol business, and it's the patrol's risk. If, on the other hand, you think that you're going to try to snuff a vortex, the stuff stays here. That's final, Storm." "You're right and wrong, Phil," Cloud stated, not at all sheepishly. "I'm going to blow out number 1 vortex with duodec, yes. But I'm really going to blow it out, not merely make a stab at it as an excuse for suicide, as you think." "How?" The big lensman's query was skepticism incarnate. "It can't be done except by an almost impossibly fortuitous accident. You yourself have been the most bitterly opposed of us to all these suicidal attempts." "I know it. I didn't have the solution myself until a few hours ago. It hit me all at once. Funny, I never thought of it before. It's been right in sight all the time." "That's the way with most problems," the chief admitted. "Plain enough after you see the key equation. Well, I'm perfectly willing to be convinced, but I warn you that I'll take a lot of convincing. And someone else will do the work, not you. When I get done, you'll see why I'll pretty nearly have to do it myself. But to convince you, exactly what is the knot?" "Variability," snapped the older man. "To be effective, the charge of explosive at the moment of impact must match, within very close limits, the activity of the vortex itself. Too small a charge scatters it around in vortices which, while much smaller than the original, are still large enough to be self-sustaining. Too large a charge simply rekindles the original vortex, still larger, in its original crater. And the activity that must be matched varies so tremendously in magnitude, maxima and minima, and the cycle is so erratic, ranging from seconds to hours without discoverable rhyme or reason, that all attempts to do so at any predetermined instant have failed completely. Why, even Kinnison and Cardinge and the Conference of Scientists couldn't solve it, any more than they could work out a tractor beam that could be used as a tow line on one." "Not exactly," Cloud demurred. "They found that it could be forecast for a few seconds at least, length of time directly proportional to the length of the cycle in question, by an extension of the calculus of warped surfaces." "Humph," the lensman snorted. "So what? What good is a 10-second forecast when it takes a calculating machine an hour to solve the equations? Oh." He broke off, staring. "Oh," he repeated slowly. "I forgot that you're a lightning calculator, a mathematical prodigy from the day you were born, who never has to use a calculating machine even to compute an orbit. But there are other things." "I'll say there are, plenty of them. I'd thought of the calculator angle before, of course, but there was a worse thing than variability to contend with." "What?" the lensman demanded. "Fear," Cloud replied crisply. "At the thought of a hand-to-hand battle with a vortex, my brain froze solid. Fear. The sheer, stark, natural human fear of death. that robs a man of the fine edge of control and brings on the very death that he is trying so hard to avoid. That's what had me stopped." "Right. You may be right," the lensman pondered, his fingers drumming quietly upon his desk. "And you are not afraid of death now, even subconsciously. But tell me, Storm, please, that you won't invite it." "I will not invite it, sir, now that I've got a job to do. But that's as far as I'll go promising. I won't make any superhuman effort to avoid it. I'll take all due precautions for the sake of the job, but if it gets me, what the hell? The quicker it does, the better, the sooner I'll be with Joe." "You believe that?" "Implicitly." "The vortices are as good as gone, then. They haven't got any more chance than Boscone has of licking the patrol." "I'm afraid so," almost glumly. "The only way for it to get me is for me to make a mistake, and I don't feel any coming on." "But what's your angle?" the lensman asked, interest lighting his eyes. "You can't use the customary attack. Your time will be too short." "Like this," and taking down a sheet of drafting paper, Cloud sketched rapidly. "This is the crater here, with the vortex at the bottom there. From the observer's instruments, or from a shielded setup of my own, I get my data on mass, emission, maxima, minima, and so on. Then I have them make me 3 duodec bombs, one on the mark of the activity I'm figuring on shooting at, and one each 5% over and under that figure, cased in neocarbaloy of exactly the computed thickness to last until it gets to the center of the vortex. Then I take off in a flying suit, armored and shielded, say about here. If you take off at all, you'll take off in a suit, inside a one-man flitter," the lensman interrupted. "Too many instruments for a suit, to say nothing of bombs, and you'll need more screen than a suit can deliver. We can adapt a flitter for bomb throwing easily enough." "QX. That would be better, of course. In that case I set my flitter into a projectile trajectory like this, whose objective is the center of the vortex there. See? 10 seconds or so away, at about this point, I take my instantaneous readings, solve the equations at that particular warped surface for some certain zero time." "But suppose that the cycle won't give you a 10-second solution?" "Then I'll swing around and try again until a long cycle does show up." "QX. It will sometime." "Sure. Then, having everything set for zero time, and assuming that the activity is somewhere near my postulated value—" "Assume that it isn't. It probably won't be," the chief grunted. "I accelerate or decelerate." "Solving new equations all the while?" "Sure. Don't interrupt so. Until at zero time the activity, extrapolated to zero time, matches one of my bombs. I cut that bomb loose, shoot myself off in a sharp curve, and zweet, powie, she's out," with an expressive sweeping gesture. "You hope," the lensman was frankly dubious. "And there you are, right in the middle of that explosion, with 2 duodec bombs outside your armor or just inside your flitter." "Oh no, I've shot them away several seconds ago so that they explode somewhere else, nowhere near me." "I hope. But do you realize just how busy a man you're going to be during those 10 or 12 seconds?" "Fully." Cloud's face grew somber. "But I will be in full control. I won't be afraid of anything that can happen. Anything. And," he went on under his breath, "that's the hell of it." "QX," the lensman admitted finally. "You can go. There are a lot of things you haven't mentioned, but you'll probably be able to work them out as you go along. I think I'll go out and work with the boys in the lookout station while you're doing your stuff. When are you figuring on starting?" "How long will it take to get the flitter ready?" "A couple of days. Say we meet you there Saturday morning." "Saturday the 10th at 8 o'clock. I'll be there." And again Neil Cloud and Babe the big blue ox hit the road. And as he rolled, the physicist mulled over in his mind the assignment to which he had set himself. Like fire, only worse, intra-atomic energy was a good servant, but a terrible master. Man had liberated it before he could really control it. In fact, control was not yet, and perhaps never would be, perfect. Up to a certain size and activity, yes, they, the millions upon millions of self-limiting ones, were the servants. They could be handled, fenced in, controlled. Indeed, if they were not kept under an exciting bombardment and very carefully fed, they would go out. But at long intervals, for some one of a dozen reasons, science knew so little fundamentally of the true inwardness of the intra-atomic reactions. One of these small, tame, self-limiting vortices flared nova-like into a large, wild, self-sustaining one. It ceased being a servant then, and became a master. Such flare-ups occurred perhaps only once or twice in a century on Earth,
The trouble was that they were so utterly, damnably permanent that they never went out, and no data were ever secured, for every living thing in the vicinity of a flare-up died. Every instrument and every other solid thing within a radius of 100 feet melted down into the reeking, boiling slag of its crater. Fortunately, the rate of growth was slow, as slow almost as it was persistent. Otherwise, civilization would scarcely have had a planet left, and unless something could be done about loose vortices before too many years, the consequences would be really serious. That's why his laboratory had been established in the first place. Nothing much had been accomplished so far. The tractor beam that would take hold of them had never been designed. Nothing material was of any use. It melted. Pressors worked after a fashion. It was by the use of these beams that they shoved the vortices around, off into the waste places, unless it proved cheaper to allow the places where they had come into being to remain waste places. A few, through sheer luck, had been blown into self-limiting bits by duodecaplylatomate, the most powerful, the most frighteningly detonant explosive ever invented upon all the known planets of the first galaxy. But duodec had taken an awful toll of life. Also, since it usually scattered a vortex instead of extinguishing it, duodec had actually caused far more damage than it had cured. No end of fantastic schemes had been proposed, of course, of varying degrees of fantasy. Some of them sounded almost practical, some of them had been tried, some of them were still being tried. Some, such as the perennially appearing one of building a huge hemispherical hull in the ground under and around the vortex, installing an inertialess drive, and shooting the whole neighborhood out into space, were perhaps feasible from an engineering standpoint. They were, however, potentially so capable of making things worse that they would not be tried, save as last-ditch measures. In short, the control of loose vortices was very much an unsolved problem. Number 1 vortex, the oldest and worst upon Tellus, had been pushed out into the Badlands, and there at 8 o'clock on the 10th, Cloud started to work upon it. The lookout station, instead of being some such ramshackle structure as might have been deduced from the lensman's casual terminology, was in fact a fully equipped observatory. Its staff was not large. 8 men worked in 3 staggered 8-hour shifts of 2 men each. But the instruments! To develop them had required hundreds of man-years of time and near miracles of research, not the least of the problems having been that of developing shielded conductors capable of carrying truly, through 5-ply screens of force, the converted impulses of the very radiations against which those screens were most effective. For the observatory, and the one long approach to it as well, had been screened heavily. Without such protection, no life could exist there. This problem and many others had been solved, however, and there the instruments were. Every phase and factor of the vortex's existence and activity were measured and recorded continuously throughout every minute of every day of every year. And all of those records were summed up, integrated into the Sigma curve. This curve, while only an incredibly and senselessly tortuous line to the layman's eye, was a veritable mine of information to the initiate. Cloud glanced along the sigma curve of the previous 48 hours and scowled, for one jagged peak, scarcely an hour old, actually punched through the top line of the chart. "Bad, huh, Frank?" he grunted. "Plenty bad, Storm, and getting worse," the observer assented. "I wouldn't wonder if Karlowitz were right after all. If she ain't getting ready to blow her top, I'm a Zabriskie and Fantima's maiden aunt. No periodicity, no equation, of course." It was a statement, not a question. The lensman ignored as completely as did the observer, if not as flippantly, the distinct possibility that at any moment the observatory and all that it contained might be resolved into their component atoms. "None whatever," came flatly from Cloud. He did not need to spend hours at a calculating machine. At one glance he knew, without knowing how he knew, that no equation could be made to fit even the weighted average locus of that wildly shifting sigma curve. "But most of the cycles cut this ordinate here, 751. So I'll take that for my value. That means 9.906 kilograms of duodec basic charge, with one 5% over and one 5% under that for alternates. Neocarb alloy casing, 53 millimeters on the basic, others in proportion. On the wire?" "It went out as you said it," the observer reported. "They'll have 'em here in 15 minutes. QX. I'll get dressed then." The lensman and the observer helped him into his cumbersome, heavily padded armor. They checked his instruments, making sure that the protective devices of the suit were functioning at full efficiency. Then all 3 went out to the flitter, a tiny speedster, really a torpedo bearing the stubby wings and the ludicrous tail surfaces. The multifarious driving, braking, side, top, and under jets so characteristic of the tricky, cranky, but ultra-maneuverable breed. But this one had something that the ordinary speedster or flitter did not carry. Spaced around the needle beak there yawned the open muzzles of a triplex bomb thrower. More checking. The lensman and the armored Cloud both knew that every one of the dozens of instruments upon the flitter's special board was right to the hair. Nevertheless, each one was compared with the master instrument of the observatory. The bombs arrived and were loaded in, and Cloud, with a casually waved salute, stepped into the tiny operating compartment. The massive door — flitters have no airlocks, as the whole midsection is scarcely bigger than an airlock would have to be — rammed shut upon its fiber gaskets. The heavy toggles drove home. A cushioned form closed in upon the pilot, leaving only his arms and lower legs free. Then, making sure that his two companions had ducked for cover, Cloud shot his flitter into the air and toward the seething inferno which was loose atomic vortex number 1. For it was seething, no fooling, and it was an inferno. The crater was a ragged, jagged hole a full mile from lip to lip, and perhaps a quarter of that in depth. It was not, however, a perfect cone, for the floor, being largely incandescently molten, was practically level except for a depression at the center where the actual vortex lay. The walls of the pit were steeply, unstably irregular, varying in pitch and shape with the hardness and refractoriness of the strata composing them. Now a section would glare into an unbearably blinding white, puffing away in sparkling vapor. Again, cooled by an inrushing blast of air, it would subside into an angry scarlet, its surface crawling in a sluggish flow of lava. Occasionally a part of the wall might even go black, into pock-marked scoriae, or into brilliant plains of obsidian. For always, somewhere, there was an enormous volume of air pouring into that crater. It rushed in as ordinary air. It came out, however, in a ragingly uprushing pillar, as something else. No one knew, or knows yet, for that matter, exactly what a loose vortex does to the molecules and atoms of air. In fact, due to the extreme variability already referred to, it probably does not do the same thing for more than an instant at a time. That there is little actual combustion is certain. That is, except for the forced combination of nitrogen, argon, xenon, and krypton with oxygen. There is, however, consumption. Plenty of consumption. And what that incredibly intense bombardment impinges up is altered. Profoundly and obscurely altered, so that the atmosphere emitted from the crater is quite definitely no longer air as we know it. It may be corrosive, it may be poisonous in one or another of 100 fashions. It may be merely new and different, but it is no longer the air which we human beings are used to breathing, and it is this fact, rather than the destruction of the planet itself, which would end the possibility of life upon Earth's surface. It is difficult indeed to describe the appearance of a loose atomic vortex to those who have never seen one, and fortunately most people never have. And practically all of its frightful radiation lies in those octaves of the spectrum which are invisible to the human eye. Suffice it to say, then, that it had an average effective surface temperature of about 15,000 degrees absolute, 2 1/2 times as hot as the sun of Tellus, and that it was radiating every frequency possible to that incomprehensible temperature, and let it go at that. And Neil Cloud, scurrying in his flitter through that murky, radiation-riddled atmosphere, setting up equations from the readings of his various meters and gauges, and solving those equations almost instantaneously in his mathematical prodigy's mind, sat appalled. For the activity level was, and even in its lowest dips, remained far above the level he had selected. His skin began to prickle and to burn. His eyes began to smart and to ache. He knew what those symptoms meant. Even the flitter's powerful screens were not stopping all the radiation. Even his suit screens and his special goggles were not stopping what leaked through. But he wouldn't quit yet. The activity might, probably would, take a nosedive any instant. If it did, he'd have to be ready. On the other hand, it might blow up at any instant, too. There were two schools of mathematical thought upon that point. One held that the vortex, without any essential change in its physical condition or nature, would keep on growing bigger, indefinitely, until, uniting with the other vortices of the planet, it had converted the entire mass of the world into energy. The second school, of which the forementioned Karlowitz was the loudest voice, taught that at a certain stage of development the internal energy of the vortex would become so great that generation radiation equilibrium could not be maintained. This would of course result in an explosion, the nature and consequences of which this Karlowitz was wont to dwell upon in ghoulish mathematical glee. Neither school, however, could prove its point, or rather each school proved its point by means of unimpeachable mathematics, and each hated and derided the other loudly and heatedly. And now Cloud, as he studied through his almost opaque defenses that indescribably ravening fireball, that assouriantly rapacious monstrosity which might very well have come from the deepest pit of the hottest hell of mythology, felt strongly inclined to agree with Carlowitz. It didn't seem possible that anything could get any worse than that without exploding, and such an explosion he felt sure would certainly blow everything for miles around into the smitheriest kind of smithereens. The activity of the vortex stayed high. Way too high. The tiny control room of the flitter grew hotter and hotter. His skin burned and his eyes ached worse. He touched a communicator stud and spoke. "Phil, better get me 3 more bombs. Like these, except up around—" "I don't check you. If you do that, it's apt to drop to a minimum and stay there," the lensman reminded him. "It's completely unpredictable, you know." "It may be at that, so I'll have to forget the 5% margin and hit it on the nose or not at all. Order me up 2 more then, one at half of what I've got here, the other double it," and he reeled off the figures for the charge and the casing of the explosive. "You might break out a jar of burn dressing too. Some fairly hot stuff is leaking through." "We'll do that. Come down fast." Cloud landed. He stripped to the skin, and the Observer smeared his every square inch of epidermis with the thick, gooey stuff that was not only a highly efficient screen against radiation, but also a sovereign remedy for new radiation burns. He exchanged his goggles for a thicker, darker, heavier pair. The 2 bombs arrived and were substituted for 2 of the original load. "I thought of something while I was up there," Cloud informed the observers then. 20 kilograms of duodec is nobody's firecracker, but it may be the least of what's going to go off. Have you got any idea of what's going to become of the energy inside that vortex when I blow it out?" "Can't say that I have," the lensman frowned in thought. "No data." "Neither have I. But I'd say you better go back to the new station, the one you were going to move to if it kept getting worse." "But the instruments!" The lensman was thinking not of the instruments themselves, which were valueless in comparison with life, but of the records those instruments would make. Those records were priceless. "I'll have everything on the tapes in the flitter," Cloud reminded. "But suppose—" "That the flitter stops one too? Or doesn't stop it, rather? In that case your back station won't be there either, so it won't make any difference." How mistaken Cloud was. "QX," the chief decided. "We'll leave when you do, just in case." Again in the air, Cloud found that the activity, while still high, was not too high, but that it was fluctuating too rapidly. He could not get even 5 seconds of trustworthy prediction, to say nothing of 10, so he waited as close as he dared remain to that horrible center of disintegration. The flitter hung poised in air, motionless upon softly hissing underjets. Cloud knew to a fraction his height above the ground. He knew to a fraction his distance from the vortex. He knew with equal certainty the density of the atmosphere and the exact velocity and direction of the wind. Hence, since he could also read closely enough the momentary variations in the cyclonic storms within the crater, he could compute very easily the course and velocity necessary to land the bomb in the exact center of the vortex at any given instant in time. The hard part, the thing that no one had as yet succeeded in doing, was to predict, for a time far enough ahead to be of any use, a usably close approximation to the vortex's quantitative activity. For, as has been said, he had to overblast rather than under. If he could not hit it on the nose, to underblast would scatter it all over the state. Therefore Cloud concentrated upon the dials and gauges before him, concentrated with every fiber of his being and every cell of his brain. Suddenly, almost imperceptibly, the sigma curve gave signs of flattening out. In an instant Cloud's mind pounced. Simultaneous equations, 9 of them, involving 9 unknowns. An integration in 4 dimensions. No matter. Cloud did not solve them laboriously. 1 factor at a time. Without knowing how he had arrived at it, he knew the answer, just as the Posinian or the Rigelian is able to perceive every separate component particle of an opaque 3-dimensional solid, but without being able to explain to anyone how his sense of perception works. It just is. That's all. Anyway, by virtue of whatever sense or ability it is which makes a mathematical prodigy what he is, Cloud knew that in exactly 8 3/10 seconds from that observed instant the activity of the vortex would be slightly, but not too far, under the coefficient of his heaviest bomb. Another flick of his mental trigger and he knew the exact velocity he would require. His hand swept over the studs, his right foot tramped down hard upon the firing lever. And even as the quivering flitter shot forward under 8 Tellurian gravities of acceleration, he knew to the thousandth of a second how long he would have to hold that acceleration to attain that velocity. While not really long in seconds, it was much too long for comfort. It took him much closer to the vortex than he wanted to be. In fact, it took him right out over the crater itself. But he stuck to the calculated course, and at the precisely correct instant he cut his drive and released his largest bomb. Then, so rapidly that it was one blur of speed, he again kicked on his 8 Gs of drive and started to whirl around as only a speedster or a flitter can whirl. Practically unconscious from the terrific resultant of the linear and angular accelerations, he ejected the 2 smaller bombs. He did not care particularly where they lit, just so they didn't light in the crater or near the observatory, and he had already made certain of that. Then, without waiting even to finish the whirl or to straighten her out in level flight, Cloud's still flying hand darted towards the switch whose closing would energize the Bergenholm and make the flitter inertialess. Too late. Hell was out for noon, with the little speedster still inert. Cloud had moved fast too. Trained mind and trained body had been working at top speed and in perfect coordination. There just simply hadn't been enough time. If he could have got what he wanted, 10 full seconds, or even 9, he could have made it, but... In spite of what happened, Cloud defended his action then and thereafter. Damn it all, he had to take the 8.3-second reading. Another tenth of a second and his bomb wouldn't have fitted. He didn't have the 5% leeway he wanted, remember, and no, he couldn't wait for another match either. His screens were leaking like sieves, and if he had waited for another chance they would have picked him up fried to a greasy cinder in his own lard. The bomb sped truly and struck the target in direct central impact, exactly as scheduled. It penetrated perfectly. The neocarb alloy casing lasted just long enough. That frightful charge of duodec exploded, if not exactly at the center of the vortex, at least near enough to the center to do the work. In other words, Cloud's figuring had been close, very close, but the time had been altogether too short. The flitter was not even out of the crater when the bomb went off. And not only the bomb, for Cloud's vague forebodings were materialized and more. The staggeringly immense energy of the vortex merged with that of the detonating duodec to form an utterly incomprehensible whole. In part, the hellish flood of boiling lava in that devil's cauldron was beaten downward into a bowl by the sheer stupendous force of the blow. In part, it was hurled abroad in masses, in gouts and streamers, and the raging wind of the explosion's front seized the fragments and tore and worried them into bits, hurling them still faster along their paths of violence. And air, so densely compressed as to be to all intents and purposes a solid, smote the walls of the crater. Smote them so that they crumbled, crushed outward through the hard-packed ground, broke up into jaggedly irregular blocks which hurtled screamingly away through the atmosphere. Also, the concussion wave, or the explosion front, or flying fragments, or something, struck the 2 loose bombs, so that they too exploded and added their contribution to the already stupendous concentration of force. They were not close enough to the flitter to wreck it of themselves, but they were close enough so that they didn't do her, or her pilot, a bit of good. The first terrific wave buffeted the flyer while Cloud's right hand was in the air, shooting across the panel to turn on the Berg. The impact jerked the arm downward and sideways, both bones of the forearm snapping as it struck the ledge. The second one, an instant later, broke his left leg. Then the debris began to arrive. Chunks of solid or semi-molten rock slammed against the hull, knocking off wings and control surfaces. Gobs of viscous slag slapped it liquidly, freezing into and clogging up jets and orifices. The little ship was hurtled hither and yon, in the grip of forces she could no more resist than can the floating leaf resist the waters of a cataract. And Cloud's brain was as addled as an egg by the vicious concussions which were hitting him from so many different directions and so nearly all at once. Nevertheless, with his one arm and his one leg and the few cells of his brain that were still at work, the physicist was still in the fight. By sheer force of will and nerve he forced his left hand across the gyrating key bank to the Bergenholm switch. He snapped it, and in the instant of its closing a vast, calm peace descended blanket-like. For fortunately the Berg still worked. The flitter and all her contents and appurtenances were inertialess. Nothing material could buffet her or hurt her now. She would waft effortlessly away from a feather's lightest possible touch. Cloud wanted to faint then, but he didn't. Quite. Instead, foggily, he tried to look back at the crater. 9/10 of his visiplates were out of commission, but he finally got a view. Good. It was out. He wasn't surprised. He had been quite confident that it would be. It wasn't scattered around either. It couldn't be, for his only possibility of smearing the shot was on the upper side, not the lower. His next effort was to locate the secondary observatory where he had to land, and in that, too, he was successful. He had enough intelligence left to realize that, with practically all of his jets clogged and his wings and tail shot off, he couldn't land his vessel inert. Therefore, he would have to land her free. And by dint of light and extremely unorthodox use of what jets he had left in usable shape, he did land her free, almost within the limits of the observatory's field, and having landed, he inerted her. But as has been intimated, his brain was not working so well. He had held his ship inertialess quite a few seconds longer than he thought, and he did not even think of the buffetings she had taken. As a result of these things, however, her intrinsic velocity did not match anywhere near exactly that of the ground upon which she lay. Thus, when Cloud cut his Bergenholm, restoring thereby to the flitter the absolute velocity and inertia she had had before going free, there resulted a distinctly anticlimactic crash. There was a last terrific bump as the motionless vessel collided with the equally motionless ground, and Storm Cloud Vortex Blaster went out like the proverbial light. Help came, of course, and on the double. The pilot was unconscious, and the flitter's door could not be opened from the outside, but those were not insuperable obstacles. A plate, already loose, was sheared away, the pilot was carefully lifted out of his prison and rushed to base hospital in the meat can, already in attendance. And later, in a private office of that hospital, the gray-clad chief of the Atomic Research Laboratory sat and waited, but not patiently. "How is he, Lacey?" he demanded as the Surgeon General entered the room. "He's going to live, isn't he?" "Oh, yes, Phil, definitely yes," Lacey replied briskly. "He has a good skeleton, very good indeed. The burns are superficial and will yield quite readily to treatment. The deeper, delayed effects of the radiation to which he was exposed can be neutralized entirely effectively. Thus he will not need even a Phillips treatment for the replacement of damaged parts, except possibly for a few torn muscles and so on." "But he was smashed up pretty badly, wasn't he? I know that he had a broken arm and a broken leg, at least." "Simple fractures only, entirely negligible." Lacey waved aside with an airy gesture such small ills as broken bones. "He'll be out in a few weeks." "How soon can I see him?" the Lensman physicist asked. "There are some important things to take up with him, and I've got a personal message for him that I must give him as soon as possible." Lacey pursed his lips. Then, "You may see him now," he decided. "He is conscious and strong enough. Not too long, though, Phil. 15 minutes at most." "QX and thanks." And a nurse led the visiting Lensman to Cloud's bedside. "Hi, Stoop," he boomed cheerfully. Stoop being short for stupendous, not stupid. "Hi, Chief. Glad to see somebody. Sit down." "You're the most wanted man in the galaxy," the visitor informed the invalid. "Not excepting even Kimball Kinnison. Look at this spool of tape, and it's only the first one. I brought it along for you to read at your leisure. As soon as any planet finds out that we've got a sure enough vortex blower outer, an expert who can really call his shots, and the news travels mighty fast, that planet sends in a double urgent Class A prime demand for first call upon your services. Sirius IV got in first by a whisker, it seems, but Aldebaran II was so close a second that it was a photo finish, and all the channels have been jammed ever since. Canopus, Vega, Rigel, Spica, they all want you. Everybody from Alsacan to Vandemar and back. We told them right off that we would not receive personal delegations. We had to almost throw a couple of pink-haired Chickaladorians out bodily to make them believe that we meant it, and that the age and condition of the vortex involved, not priority of requisition, would govern. QX?" "Absolutely," Cloud agreed. "That's the only way it could be, I should think." "So forget about this psychic trauma." "No, I don't mean that." The Lensman corrected himself hastily. "You know what I mean. The will to live is the most important factor in any man's recovery, and too many worlds need you too badly to have you quit now. Not?" "I suppose so," Cloud acquiesced, but somberly. "I'll get out of here in short order, and I'll keep on pecking away until one of those vortices finishes what this one started." "You'll die of old age then, son," the Lensman assured him. "We got full data. All the information we need. We know exactly what to do to your screens. Next time, nothing will come through except light, and only as much of that as you feel like admitting. You can wait as close to a vortex as you please for as long as you please until you get exactly the activity and time interval that you want. You will be just as comfortable and just as safe as though you were home in bed." "Sure of that?" "Absolutely. Or at least as sure as we can be of anything that hasn't happened yet. But I see that your guardian angel here is eyeing her clock somewhat pointedly, so I'd better be doing a flit before they toss me down a shaft. Clear ether, Storm. Clear ether, Chief." And that is how Storm Cloud, atomic physicist, became the most narrowly specialized specialist in all the annals of science. How he became Storm Cloud, Vortex Blaster, the galaxy's only Vortex Blaster.